There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a story after it ends, a stillness where the details linger longer than the moments themselves. The Orange Islands season of the Pokémon anime holds that kind of quiet, a second chapter that most fans remember as the one between two larger things, and yet it was there, in that gentle in between, that some of the most unusual and carefully imagined storytelling in the entire series took shape. Ash Ketchum traveled through a tropical archipelago unlike any region he had visited before, collecting badges shaped like coral and sea glass, riding on the back of a lapras through warm water routes, and meeting a companion named Tracy who carried a sketchbook instead of ambitions. And before you drift any further, settle in as we begin tonight's relaxing journey through the world of Pokemon. If this helps you unwind, subscribe to join the Cozy Club. It all began with something left unfinished, a task as simple and strange as delivering a Pokeball no one could open. The GS ball arrived in the story without ceremony or explanation. It was smooth and gold and striped, divided neatly between the colors of day and night, and it could not be opened by any tool or technique that Professor Oak possessed. He sent Ash to Professor Ivy on Valencia Island, the first stop in what would become an entire season of travel, asking him to carry this small mysterious object across open water to a researcher who might understand it better. The errand seemed minor at first, almost incidental, a narrative excuse to send the group south into warmer weather. But the GS ball would follow the story all the way to its final episode, passed from hand to hand without ever being explained, becoming one of the most quietly persistent, unsolved objects in the early anime's history. Valencia Island introduced a different kind of Pokemon world from the one Ash had known in Kanto. Professor Ivy ran a research facility focused on how tropical environments changed Pokemon over time, studying creatures whose colors had shifted slightly from their mainland counterparts due to differences in sunlight, habitat, and climate. The Pokemon on her island were still recognizable, still the same species, but there was something softer about them, something touched by the particular quality of the southern light. Ash watched a Vileplume whose purple coloring had faded toward a gentler lavender, and Eradicate whose fur had turned almost cream where it should have been brown. The island itself felt like a place where the usual rules had been loosened slightly, where nature had been given a little more room to experiment on its own terms. It was on Valencia Island that Brock chose to stay behind. He had been a constant presence since the very beginning of the journey, the one who cooked every meal, the one who remembered which berries were edible and which Pokemon needed salt in their diet, the one who offered advice in a tone that made it sound almost like common sense. And then quietly, without drama, he decided that Professor Ivy's laboratory was where he wanted to be. He said goodbye to Ash and Misty with the particular warmth of someone who has made a choice rather than suffered a loss, and he disappeared from the story for the season, leaving a space that felt both natural and slightly tender to anyone who had spent 40 episodes expecting him to always be there. Tracy Sketchit arrived to fill that space, though filling is not quite the right word for what he did. He occupied a different portion of the story, lighter in some ways and more observational. He was a Pokemon watcher rather than a trainer, a distinction he made clearly and which the show honored consistently. Where Ash assessed Pokemon for battle and Brock assessed them for their care needs, Tracy simply watched. He carried a sketchbook and a set of pencils, and he recorded what he saw with the patient attention of someone who believed that looking carefully at something was itself a form of respect. His three Pokemon, a Venonat, a Marill, and a Scyther, were not battle specialists but companions, chosen for how they helped him observe and navigate the world rather than how they performed in combat. Scyther was the most visually striking of Tracy's team, a tall and angular creature whose blades had seen many battles before it came to Tracy's side. There was an old and weathered quality to Scyther when it first appeared, a faint sense of accumulated history, of a creature that had lived through things it did not need to explain. Tracy found it injured and chose to help rather than capture, and Scyther allowed itself to be helped, which in its own quiet way was a form of trust. The bond between them was established not through a dramatic battle or a moment of shared triumph, but through the simpler gesture of one being caring for another without needing anything in return. It was the kind of relationship the Orange Islands arc returned to repeatedly, the idea that connection does not always require a contest to make it real. Maril was small and round and appeared very early in the season, several episodes before it was officially introduced as a species in the wider franchise, making it one of the first glimpses of what would eventually become a new generation of Pokémon. Tracy's Maril used its sensitive round ears to detect sounds and movements through solid rock and thick undergrowth, functioning as a kind of living compass in caves and forests where direction was difficult to maintain. Its ability to hear beyond normal range made it genuinely useful in ways that had nothing to do with combat, and watching it perform this function was one of the quieter pleasures the season offered, a small creature doing something specific and real, and surprisingly interesting. The Orange Islands themselves were built around a geography unlike anything the Pokémon anime had depicted before. They were an archipelago, a loose scattering of islands across a wide stretch of warm ocean, and they had their own regional Pokémon League with rules and customs that departed significantly from the mainland system Ash had competed in for the first season. Instead of gym leaders who specialized in a single type and awarded badges based on battle victories, the Orange Crew, as the island's elite trainers were known, tested challengers through specific tasks and unusual conditions that often had little to do with raw power. It was a competition shaped by the environment rather than imposed upon it, and that difference gave the Orange League its particular texture. The first of the Orange Crew gym leaders Ash encountered was Sissy on Myken Island. Her approach to the challenge was twofold, asking Ash to demonstrate accuracy rather than force in the first half, and speed and endurance in the second. They used water pistol contests and racing across the water's surface, and what made the encounter interesting was not the outcome, but the underlying philosophy it represented. Sissy did not want to see Ash's Pokémon overpower her own. She wanted to see whether Ash and Pikachu had developed the kind of collaborative precision that comes from extended trust, the ability to adjust in real time rather than simply issue commands and hope for the best. Pikachu's performance during the Myken Island Challenge was subtle by the standards of most Pokémon battles. It was not the most powerful version of Pikachu the show had ever depicted. It was careful. It aimed small and it waited. That willingness to be precise rather than overwhelming said something about where Ash was as a trainer at that point in the story, not the beginning student who threw every available attack at once, but not yet the polished competitor he would eventually become. He was somewhere in the middle, learning that restraint could be its own kind of strength. The coral pink badge that Sissy awarded after the challenge was the first of 4 Ash would collect across the archipelago. The Orange League badges were visually distinct from their Kanto counterparts, organic in shape and varied in color, more closely resembling things found in tide pools and reef systems than the formal geometric designs of mainland gym badges. When collected and arranged, they had a quality that was less institutional and more personal, as if each one marked not just a test passed, but a particular place visited and a particular moment inhabited. The second gym leader Ash encountered was Danny on Naval Island, a mountain that rose steeply from the ocean and demanded a physical climb before the challenge could even begin. Danny was confident and relaxed in the way of someone who lives at altitude and has watched many challengers arrive breathless at the top and his challenge involved a frozen spring and a race down the mountain rather than a conventional battle. Ash and his Pokémon carved a sled from the ice of the spring together, and the effort of the carving and the race that followed said more about cooperation under pressure than any formal match could have. The cold and the slope and the time constraint created conditions where what mattered was not who had the strongest team, but who had thought most carefully about what each member of the team could do. Ash's Lapras appeared early in the Orange Islands arc and became the primary means of travel across the open water between islands. It was a young Lapras, separated from its family and found alone near the shore of a beach where the water was still warm in the late season. Ash did not capture it in the conventional sense, but offered it a kind of temporary companionship, a shared journey that would end when the Lapras found its way back to the school it had been separated from. That arrangement gave the relationship a particular quality, more tender than most trainer Pokemon bonds the show depicted, because both parties understood from the beginning that it was not permanent. Lapras was enormous, even as a young member of its species, long and smooth and blue-green in color, with the distinctive shell structure that gave the species its distinctive silhouette when seen from above the water. It moved through the ocean with the unhurried grace of something that had evolved over a very long time to be exactly where it was, and riding on its back through the calm morning waters of the Orange Islands had a particular feeling that the show rendered carefully, the sense of the world being very large and the moment being very small, and both of those things being exactly right. The season's treatment of Team Rocket changed in small but perceptible ways from what had come before. Jesse, James, and Meowth received an official mission at the beginning of the arc, a directive from Giovanni that placed them in charge of a dirigible and gave their pursuit of Pikachu a formal context it had sometimes lacked. The blimp was aging and unreliable, and they were largely incompetent at operating it, which led to the kind of chaotic situations the trio had always generated, but now with an additional layer of institutional absurdity, the sense that Team Rocket as an organization had decided to make these three people responsible for something and was now having to live with that decision. Giovanni himself appeared briefly and more than once during the Orange Islands arc, speaking to Jesse and James through communication systems that never quite worked properly, issuing instructions that were both precise and somehow beside the point. His presence served as a reminder that Team Rocket was not simply three hapless individuals, but a network with actual resources and ambitions, and that Jesse and James existed somewhere between genuine agents and almost forgotten employees. That positioning gave their repeated failures a texture that was more melancholy than purely comic, though the comedy was always there too. James's relationship with his Pokémon during the Orange Islands arc continued to develop in the particular way the show had established from the beginning, with genuine affection running beneath the surface of every interaction and occasionally breaking through in moments that were genuinely touching. He was a trainer who cared about his Pokémon in ways his organization would not have valued and perhaps would not have approved of, and that disconnect between who he was and where he belonged was part of what made his character feel real in a way that pure villainy never would have. Weezing drifted beside him like a small purple cloud that had decided to become loyal to someone, and that loyalty felt earned rather than assigned. Meowth occupied a unique position in the trio, the translator and the interpreter, the one who could speak directly to Pokemon and then carry their words into human conversation without loss or distortion. This ability had been established early in the first season as the result of long effort and unusual determination, a self-taught skill that made Meowth something genuinely rare in the world of the show. He had learned human language and human emotion because he had wanted something very much and had worked toward it through years of practice in isolation, and whatever one thought of his current situation and allegiances, that origin carried its own quiet dignity. The third gym leader of the Orange crew was Rudy on Trevita Island, and his challenge involved multiple battle rounds against Pokémon that matched the types of Ash's own team, creating a mirrored combat structure that tested adaptability rather than type advantage. Rudy was also notable for his interest in Misty, which gave the episode a different emotional texture than the gym battles that surrounded it, layering a personal complication over what might otherwise have been a straightforward competition. Misty's response to Rudy's attention was handled with the particular careful ambiguity that characterized her emotional life throughout the series, never quite closing a door, but never fully opening one either. Misty's role in the Orange Islands arc was both smaller and in some ways more clearly defined than it had been in the Kanto season. She traveled, she cared for Togepi, she provided the perspective of someone who was not primarily interested in competition, and who therefore sometimes saw things that Ash and Tracy missed because they were looking at different things. Her expertise with water-type Pokemon gave her moments of genuine authority in coastal settings, and her ongoing relationship with the Togepi she had hatched from the egg found at the end of the first season deepened into something that felt more like guardianship than ownership. Togepi was small and round and perpetually cheerful in the way of very young things that have not yet learned to distinguish between safety and danger and therefore treat everything with the same open curiosity. It rode in Misty's arms most of the time, observing the world from a position of protected elevation, and its presence in a scene consistently introduced a gentle note into whatever was happening, even in moments of conflict. The show used it as a tonal instrument as much as a character, a small, bright thing that reminded the audience that there was always something easy and good happening somewhere just outside the frame of the crisis. Ash's Charizard was present throughout the Orange Islands arc, but operated under the same constraints that had applied since its evolution late in the first season. It was powerful beyond anything else in Ash's possession, and it was entirely unwilling to follow orders it found beneath its dignity, which meant that it was essentially unavailable as a resource during most of the conventional battles Ash engaged in. The tension created by having a Pokemon of extraordinary capability that would simply not cooperate was something the show handled with more consistency than one might expect, using Charizard's refusals as genuine plot elements rather than ignoring the contradiction. The moment when Charizard began to change came slowly and then all at once during a sequence that remains one of the most affecting in the season. Ash encountered a Poliwrath with which Charizard was badly outmatched, and rather than retreating from the battle, Charizard endured it with a stubbornness that eventually became something more than defiance. Ash spent the night after the defeat keeping Charizard warm through the cold hours before dawn, rubbing its tail and talking to it, and refusing to leave. And when morning came, Charizard's relationship with Ash had shifted in a way that neither of them fully explained, but both clearly understood. It flew in a later battle without hesitation, following instructions with the precision of something that had decided to commit, and that commitment felt like it had been earned through the night's cold and the small, faithful gesture of simply staying. The fourth and final gym leader of the Orange crew was Luana on Kumquat Island, who used a double battle format that was unusual for the anime at that point in its history. She fielded two Pokemon simultaneously, and the challenge required Ash to synchronize two of his own in a way that genuine battle strategy at that level demands, anticipating not just one Pokemon's movements, but two, reading how each one's action created conditions for the other. The double battle format would eventually become a formal mechanic in the main game series, but at the time of the Orange Islands arc, it appeared here as something peculiar and regional, a local invention that made the challenge distinctive. Ash's performance in the Kumquat Island Challenge reflected how much the season had changed him. He was looser in his approach, more willing to improvise, better at reading the space of a battle rather than just the immediate confrontation in front of him. The careful and sometimes over instructive Ash of the Kanto season had been replaced by someone who had traveled and failed and adjusted and traveled again, and the adjustments had accumulated into something that looked, in quiet moments, like actual competence. The coral badge at the end of the challenge was the last one he needed, and collecting it carried a satisfaction that the show let sit quietly without too much ceremony. The Orange League Championship was held on Pomelo Island and contested against Drake, the supreme commander of the Orange Crew, whose team included some of the strongest Pokémon in the southern islands. The stadium was larger and more formal than the island gym settings that had preceded it, with stands and a crowd and the particular charged atmosphere of a genuine competition rather than a test. Drake was a trainer of the old kind, experienced and composed, someone who had defeated many challengers with the calm efficiency of someone who has been doing a difficult thing for a very long time and has simply become good at it. The battle between Ash and Drake unfolded across 6 Pokemon on each side, following full league rules rather than the modified formats the island gyms had used. Ash's team cycled through its members as Drake's own team pushed back hard, and the progression of the match had a quality that better official competitions in the show rarely achieved, the sense of momentum shifting genuinely rather than being controlled by the plot's needs. Ash lost Pokemon and adapted. Drake lost ground and pushed back. The outcome arrived not from a single overwhelming moment, but from the accumulation of small decisions made well and made quickly enough to matter. Dragonite appeared as Drake's final Pokemon, enormous and orange and seemingly impossible to overcome with what remained of Ash's team. Dragonite was a species that the anime had depicted before, but rarely in a context that emphasized its full power, and watching Drake's Dragonite absorb attack after attack while continuing to function was a reminder that the Orange Islands had been building toward this moment for the whole season. The sense of scale was carefully managed, the gap between what Ash had and what he needed closing slowly and not entirely, so that when Pikachu finally delivered the decisive blow, it felt improbable in the way that genuinely great competitive moments do, earned rather than guaranteed. The Orange League trophy was real and physical, and Ash carried it home in his arms with the slightly dazed expression of someone who has achieved something and not yet fully processed that it happened. The season had been built around a different kind of competition from the Pokemon League he had failed to win in Kanto, and winning it felt different too, quieter and less formal, more like a thing that had happened to a real person in a real place than a story arriving at its predetermined destination. Ash held it on the boat back to Pallet Town and looked at it in the way that people look at things they are still deciding what to mean to them. Professor Oak received the GS ball at the end of the season with the same genuine enthusiasm he brought to everything related to Pokemon research, promising to study it and report back on whatever he discovered. The ball had traveled with Ash across the entire archipelago, riding in his bag through battles and island crossings and quiet evenings at harbor towns, and it had never once opened or explained itself. Oak's plan to take it to Kurt, a specialist in Pokeball construction from the Johto region, was the seed of the next season planted at the base of the one just ending, and it had the feel of something the story was very gently passing forward rather than urgently pushing. Tracy's decision to stay in Pallet Town as Professor Oak's assistant was handled with the same lightness that had characterized his arrival at the beginning of the season. He was not leaving the story dramatically. He was simply finding where he belonged and choosing to stay there, which was its own kind of resolution, the quiet kind that does not announce itself. His sketchbooks went with him into Oak's laboratory, and the idea of him there, cataloging and observing and drawing, felt right in the way that things feel right when a character reaches a place that fits the particular shape of who they are. Brock's return to the main group at the very end of the season was brief and lightly handled, arriving with the comic implication that his time with Professor Ivy had ended badly without ever specifying why, and that he had found his way back to Ash and Misty in the way of someone who has realized that home is the place you came from, even when you chose to leave it. His appearance at Ash's door in Pallet Town carried a warmth that the season had made the audience miss through its absence, the particular warmth of a presence that registers most clearly when it is no longer there. The rivalry between Ash and Gary Oak ran quietly beneath the entire season, even though Gary himself appeared only at its edges. His journey through the Johto region had been proceeding while Ash was occupied with the Orange Islands, and the news of it arrived at the end of the arc with the particular weight of information that reframes what came before. Gary had been growing as a trainer in a different direction, choosing a different path with the same competitive energy he had always carried, and the version of him that returned to Pallet Town at the season's end was harder to read than the one who had left it. Their brief battle before the journey to Johto began was short and definitive in Gary's favor, and it served its purpose precisely, reminding Ash and the audience that winning the Orange League had not made him the best trainer in the world, only a better version of the one he had been. The Pokémon that Ash left behind and the ones he carried forward marked the quiet arithmetic of what the season had cost and given in return. Lapra was returned to its school in the warm waters near its home island, a reunion handled with the gentle care the show gave to goodbyes that felt genuinely earned. The farewell was not dramatic in the conventional sense. There was no crisis, no danger, no final battle. There was only a young trainer standing at the edge of the water, watching a creature he had come to love swim back toward a life that had existed before he arrived in it and would continue after he left. That image of Ash watching from the shore as Lapras disappeared into the open sea was one of the season's most quietly affecting, a small ending at the edge of a large world. The sea itself was the season's dominant landscape, something the Kanto season had never quite offered, that sense of being surrounded by water in every direction and of the land being the exception rather than the rule. The islands of the Orange Archipelago were spaces carved out of ocean rather than ocean existing at the edges of land, and that inversion gave the season a different spatial feeling, more open and more contingent, as if the ground beneath the story was always just one wrong turn from being replaced by deep water. Travel had weight in this setting because getting it wrong had consequences, and the episodes set on boats and Lapras back and occasionally mid-flight above the open water carried a different kind of tension from anything that happened on solid ground. The tropical climate of the Orange Islands extended its influence into every visual element of the season. Colors were brighter and more saturated than they had been in the temperate regions of Kanto, the backgrounds rendered with the particular density of equatorial environments, where growing things press against every available surface. The beaches were wide and pale, and the water was depicted in multiple overlapping shades of blue and green, shifting depending on depth and angle, and the fruit that appeared in background markets and roadside stands was round and heavy and colored in oranges and yellows that seemed to vibrate slightly in the animation. The season was not simply set in a warm place. It was built from warmth, using color and light as structural elements as much as narrative ones. The Pokémon unique to the Orange Islands or significantly connected to its environment included several that the show used to reinforce the region's distinct ecological character. Seal and dugong appeared along coastal routes, where the water grew cold near rocky outcroppings, their smooth forms cutting through the current with the efficiency of animals that had been designed for exactly this environment. Goldine and Seeking moved through the reef systems in coordinated groups, their movements followed carefully by Tracy's sketching pencil on more than one occasion. The reef scenes had a quality of quiet attention to them, the camera dwelling on the underwater world with unusual patience, as if recognizing that this was a place that rewarded looking carefully. The Jigglypuff, who had been following Ash's group since early in the first season, continued to appear throughout the Orange Islands arc, arriving in island towns with the persistence of something that cannot be shaken and does not want to be. Its pattern was always the same: the song, the audience falling asleep, the marker used on sleeping faces, the fury at the lack of appreciation. That pattern had been established so firmly by this point in the series that it required almost no setup, only the pink silhouette in the background and the familiar held microphone, and the audience could anticipate what would follow with the comfortable pleasure of a familiar ritual. Repetition in the right keys can become something very close to comfort. Team Rocket's methods in the Orange Islands occasionally grew more elaborate than their usual improvised attempts, as if the formal mission structure and the actual blimp gave them both resources and expectations they were trying to live up to. There were mechanical traps and disguises of unusual complexity, and at least one scheme involving a Pokémon that had been genuinely misrepresented to them as being more powerful than it actually was. The gap between their ambitions and their outcomes never closed, but in the Orange Islands, the ambitions were sometimes impressive enough that the gap itself seemed wider and funnier and somehow more affectionate than it had been when they were simply three people chasing a mouse through tall grass. The episode involving the crystal onyx was one of the season's most visually distinctive, featuring a variant of the rock-type serpent Pokémon whose body was composed of translucent crystal rather than solid stone. The crystal onyx appeared in a sea cave, accessible only at low tide, on a small island where a young glassblower had been trying to find it for years, seeking inspiration for a creative project that had been stalled by grief and uncertainty. The premise engaged with themes of artistic struggle and natural wonder in ways that felt genuine rather than didactic, using the crystal onyx not as a battle opponent, but as something encountered and then allowed to remain free, which was itself a kind of statement about what was worth pursuing and why. The glass-blowing setting gave the episode a particular texture, the workshop full of color and heat, and the patient transformation of raw material into delicate shape, a process that had obvious resonances with the kind of development the season was tracking in its main characters. Tracy's sketching found its natural counterpart in the glassblower's craft, both of them devoted to capturing something real in a form that could be held and kept, and the conversation between Tracy and the young artisan was one of the season's quieter pleasures, two people recognizing in each other a similar devotion to the act of careful looking. The pirate subplot that appeared late in the season involved a crew intercepting ships in the waters near the Lapras family's home range, and its resolution brought together Ash's care for Lapras with a more direct confrontation than the season had generally offered. Officer Jenny appeared in this storyline as she had appeared throughout the anime, consistent and professional and slightly exasperated by the situations she was called upon to resolve. The pirates were eventually apprehended, and Team Rocket was caught up in the arrest, which was handled with the light touch the show brought to situations where its recurring antagonists ended up suffering the same consequences as the villains they had been nominally assisting. The episode set in a harbor town where Ash encountered a young trainer named Marin and her herd of Lapras was structured around the question of belonging, about what a Pokémon is when it is part of a group rather than an individual, and what a trainer owes to that group when their own interest and the group's well-being come into tension. Ash's own Lapras participated in a race through the harbor channels with other Lapras from Marin's herd, and its performance was influenced by the fact that it was still young and still learning, still in the early stages of the confidence that comes from practice and familiarity. The race was not particularly dramatic, but it had the quality of an honest depiction of something real, the small, incremental progress that comes before the decisive moments. The season's relationship with nostalgia was complicated in an interesting way. It was a transitional arc placed between two more structurally prominent seasons, and it knew that about itself, making occasional references back to events from the first season and forward to what was coming in a way that acknowledged its in between position without apologizing for it. Ash's promise to return for Pidgeot was one of these backward looking threads, a commitment made in the first episode of the season that the show never technically fulfilled, but kept in the background as a reminder that the story contained more than any single season could resolve. The Pokemon Rangers that appeared across several episodes of the Orange Islands arc operated differently from the gym leaders and league officials the show typically depicted. They were figures of practical authority rather than competitive authority, responsible for Pokemon in the wild rather than Pokemon in battles, and their concerns were ecological and protective rather than competitive. Their presence expanded the world of the show in ways that would become more significant in later series, suggesting that Pokemon training was one relationship among many that humans could have with Pokemon, not the only one, and not necessarily always the most important one. Snorlax appeared in one of the season's more extended storylines, involving the systematic destruction of the grapefruit orchards on Naval Island. 7 Snorlax had been eating their way through the orchard in a progression that moved from one grove to the next with the casual thoroughness of creatures for whom the concept of too much food does not exist. The solution involved Jigglypuff, whose song was used to put the Snorlax to sleep, while Ash attempted to catch them, and the episode balanced the comedy of the situation with a genuine problem-solving structure that gave it more narrative weight than a pure gag episode would have carried. Ash caught one of the Snorlax, which joined his team and immediately became one of the heaviest logistical complications in his roster. The second half of the season deepened the Lapras storyline in ways that gave the traveling relationship between Ash and the young Lapras more emotional texture. They encountered other Lapras in different parts of the archipelago, and Ash's Lapras responded to these encounters in ways that slowly revealed the shape of the loss it had experienced when separated from its school. Those responses were not dramatic. They were small hesitations and particular attentiveness, and a quality of longing that the animation expressed through stillness rather than movement. The show's handling of Lapra's homesickness was one of the season's more genuinely affecting, ongoing threads, precisely because it did not resolve quickly or easily, or through any single decisive moment. The summer heat of the Orange Islands was a physical presence in the season in a way that weather rarely was in Kanto. Episodes set in the midday hours often depicted Ash and Tracy seeking shade and carrying water, their Pokemon moving more slowly in the heavy warmth of the afternoon. This attention to the physical reality of the environment, to how heat changes the pace of things and the choices people make, gave the season a different rhythm from the one the show had established in cooler regions. Rest was depicted as a genuine necessity rather than a narrative pause, and that recognition that living things require rest gave the traveling sequences a quality of care that felt honest. The eventual reunion between Ash's Lapras and the school it had been separated from was handled with the unhurried patience that the show brought to its best goodbyes. The school appeared on the water ahead of the group, and Ash's Lapras recognized it before anyone else did, moving differently, with a new urgency that changed the quality of the water around it. The meeting between Lapras and its family was depicted primarily through behavior, through the way the other Lapras surrounded the young one and moved with it, the school reforming around the absence it had contained and making it whole again. Ash watched this from above the water and said very little, which was the right choice, because the moment did not need explanation and would have been diminished by it. Gary's brief appearance at the season's end served as a structural anchor for everything that followed. He had been growing in an unseen direction throughout the season, and the version of him that appeared in Pallet Town was more composed and more difficult to read than the confident rival who had taunted Ash through most of the first season. The battle between Pikachu and Gary's Eevee was short enough to be startling. Ash's confidence from the Orange League dissolved in the space of a few exchanges, and the defeat was clean and final and handled without cruelty on Gary's part. It was, in its quiet way, exactly what the season needed as its closing note, a reminder that every ending is also a beginning, and that what has been learned is the preparation for what has not yet been faced. The season's final image placed Ash, Misty, and Brock at the edge of Pallet Town, looking outward toward Johto, with the particular quality of readiness that comes not from certainty, but from willingness. Behind them was everything that had happened in the islands, the coral badges, and the crystal caves, and the pirate ships, and the Lapras watching, and the long, warm evenings in harbor towns. Ahead of them was everything they did not yet know. The story stood in that space between what had been and what was coming, and it held the position with the gentle confidence of a season that knew exactly what it had been asked to do and had done it without fuss, without apology, and without requiring anyone's permission to matter. What the Orange Islands arc offered to the larger Pokémon story was not a revolution, but a deepening. It took the established relationships and tested them in different conditions, placed the characters in a warmer and more open environment, and watched how they responded, gave them new companions and new kinds of challenges, and a trophy at the end that meant something specific rather than everything in general. It was a season that understood its own scale, that recognized the value of being the gentle story between two larger ones rather than insisting on being the largest story itself. The quiet pleasures it offered accumulated in the way that the best travel does, not through the dramatic highlights, but through the texture of ordinary days in places that are different enough from home to make you pay attention. A Jigglypuff arriving in yet another island town. Tracy's pencil moving across paper in the early morning light before anyone else was awake. Misty's voice rising in argument and then quieting into something that was almost laughter. Ash looking at a Pokémon he did not recognize and reaching for his Pokédex with the automatic gesture of someone who is always curious, always reaching toward the next thing. Those textures are what the season deposited into the memory of the series, not as major events, but as accumulated atmosphere, the particular quality of warmth and ocean and small discoveries that the Orange Islands generated at its best. They existed alongside the battles and the badge collecting and the Team Rocket failures, neither more nor less important than those things, but present in a different way, the way that place is always present in a story even when it is not the subject of the sentence. Another quiet detail appears when considering how the season handled time. The Orange Islands arc did not feel rushed. It moved through its islands at the pace of someone who has decided to actually be where they are, rather than simply passing through it, and that quality of presence, of genuine inhabitation of the location, gave the story a different texture from seasons that moved quickly through their regions in a hurry to reach the League. The islands were not a corridor to something else. They were the destination, and the show honored that distinction by taking them seriously. The season's understanding of what a journey costs was more nuanced than it had been in the first season. Ash left things behind in the Orange Islands that he did not try to replace: Lapras, a certain phase of his relationship with Charizard, the comfortable understanding that Brock would always be there, Tracy's easy company on the road. These losses were not dramatized. They were allowed to settle into the background and become part of the particular weight that experience adds to a person over time. By the season's end, Ash was heavier in this way, carrying more of what had happened to him, and that weight was not a burden so much as a quality, the particular density of someone who has traveled and paid attention. The ending moved slowly. Not all endings do. Some endings arrive quickly. A pivot and a cut, and suddenly you are in the next thing. But the Orange Island's ending took its time, letting each goodbye happen at its proper pace, letting each character find their next position before the story released them into it. There was something deliberate about that unhurried quality, a recognition that the audience had spent an entire season in this warm place and deserved the chance to leave it properly rather than being rushed out through a door held barely open. And so the story of the Orange Islands was carried back to Pallet Town and then handed forward to the Johto region with the GS ball tucked into Ash's bag and the coral badges somewhere safe and the memory of warm water roots and island gems and a lapras swimming home. The archipelago settled back behind the narrative, becoming one of those particular places in a long story that exists primarily in the peripheral vision of what came after, present in the way that all formative things remain present, not as the foreground, but as the quality of light that the foreground is seen in. There is something worth pausing over in the geography of how the Orange Islands were introduced to audiences who had spent an entire previous season in Kanto. Kanto was a region organized around roads, literal paths connecting towns that had been built around the logic of land travel, of following a route from one certified gym to the next in a sequence that felt institutional and deliberate. The Orange Islands had no such organizing principle. They were scattered across open water without a single fixed route between them, and the order in which Ash visited them was determined more by wind and lapras than by any official map or recommended progression. That difference in spatial logic was not incidental. It shaped everything about how the season felt to watch. When a journey has no fixed path, it acquires a different quality of uncertainty from the kind that comes from not knowing the outcome. In Kanto, Ash always knew which town he was heading toward, even when he did not know how to get there. In the Orange Islands, the next destination was sometimes unclear, even in principle, discovered through conversation with islanders, or through the accidental discovery of a direction. That open-endedness gave the season something it would have been difficult to manufacture deliberately, a feeling of actual exploration rather than the managed version of exploration that most adventure stories depict, where the explorer follows a route that the audience understands even when the character does not. The boat that carried Ash and his companions between islands in the early part of the season before Lapras arrived was an ordinary boat. Nothing remarkable about it, crewed by people with no interest in Pokémon training and no particular knowledge of the archipelago beyond the routes they traveled regularly. Those early boat journeys had the quality of real transit, of the space between places that has no particular character of its own. They were filled with the ordinary sensory details of being at sea, the smell of salt and engine, the particular sound of water against a hull, the flattening of perspective that happens on open ocean when there is nothing near enough to provide scale. The show rendered this transit with unusual faithfulness, neither romanticizing it nor cutting away from it too quickly. The ocean, as a physical and narrative environment in the Orange Island season, was treated with more consistency and more respect than any water-adjacent setting in the first season had been. Kanto had its oceans, its routes over water that Ash had surfed across on the back of various water-type Pokémon, but those stretches of blue were primarily obstacles, things between land masses that had to be crossed rather than environments with their own character and logic. In the Orange Islands, The water was the primary environment. The land was what you arrived at after the journey. The ocean was where you lived. This inversion produced interesting effects on the season's sense of rhythm. Dry land in the Orange Islands was an event, a destination, a place where things happened and then you returned to the water. The water was the constant, the baseline, the medium through which the story moved. Episodes that took place entirely on islands had a settled, contained quality that contrasted with the expansive openness of the ocean sequences, and that contrast was used deliberately in the pacing, giving the story room to breathe by alternating between confinement and openness, between the particular specificity of an island community and the undifferentiated vastness of the sea around it. Tracy's sketching practice took on new dimensions in this environment. He was recording not just Pokémon but places, capturing the particular quality of light on water in the late afternoon, the way that coastal rock formations created shelter that certain Pokémon preferred, the behavior of seabird analogs wheeling above fishing boats in the early morning. His sketchbooks accumulated the Orange Islands in a different way from how a trainer's experience accumulates them, not as a series of battles and defeats and small victories, but as a continuous visual record of what the place actually looked like from the position of someone who was paying attention to it rather than moving through it. The Pokewatcher designation that Tracy carried was not simply a personality quirk or a way of distinguishing him from Ash. It implied a particular philosophy about what the relationship between humans and Pokemon could be, one grounded in observation and documentation rather than capture and training. Tracy did not think Ash's approach was wrong. He had enormous respect for skilled trainers and genuine excitement about watching good battles. But he also held space for the idea that watching and drawing and recording was itself a valuable way of engaging with Pokemon, one that generated knowledge without requiring the Pokemon to compete or perform. That philosophy made Tracy a useful narrative counterweight to Ash's more competition-focused perspective, but it also meant that his arc through the season was less clearly structured than Ash's. Ash had badges to collect and a championship to win. Tracy had observations to make and sketches to fill. His version of progress was harder to measure and harder to dramatize, which may be one reason the show eventually moved him into Professor Oak's laboratory, where his careful attentiveness could be put to documented use. He was a character whose strengths were more naturally suited to research than to adventure, and the season's conclusion honored that truth about him without treating it as a limitation. The gym badge system of the Orange Islands was administered through a process that bore superficial resemblance to the Kanto gym system, but differed from it in ways that mattered. The Orange Crew gyms were not divided by type specialization, which meant that Ash could not prepare for them by assembling teams with specific type advantages. He had to be ready for whatever condition or format the leader imposed, which required a broader kind of preparation and a more flexible approach to using the Pokemon he had. That flexibility, the willingness to adapt the team to the situation, rather than to build the situation around the team, was one of the key skills the season developed in Ash, and it showed in how he battled by its end. Sissy's water pistol contest, which opened the Orange League Challenge sequence, was a direct test of something very specific, the accuracy that comes from a trainer and Pokemon having practiced together long enough to calibrate their movements to each other. A Pokemon that simply fires its best attack and hopes is not accurate. A Pokemon that has been trained to listen to very small directional cues, to adjust trajectory based on feedback from the trainer, to understand that power without precision accomplishes nothing, that Pokemon can hit targets that better equipped but less attuned teams would consistently miss. Pikachu's performance in the accuracy challenge was a quiet demonstration of how far the relationship between Ash and his starter had come since the early stumbling episodes of the first season. The racing component of the Meekin Island Challenge was water based and tested endurance rather than explosive power. The ability to sustain effort over a longer distance rather than to deliver maximum impact in a single moment. This was a test that pure power could not pass, requiring instead the consistent generation of controlled output, which is a different kind of strength from the one that shows up in standard battles. The Orange Islands gym challenges consistently asked this kind of question, probing not what a Pokemon could do at its maximum, but what it could sustain over the course of an actual contest that had duration and changing conditions, and the kind of real time adjustment that no pre battle preparation can fully anticipate. Danny's challenge on Novel Island engaged the physical world in a way that gym battles in permanent arenas cannot. The ice carving and mountain racing format required Ash to engage with the landscape itself, to use the materials available in the environment, rather than to deploy moves in a controlled space. The challenge was simultaneously more primitive and more sophisticated than a standard gym battle, more primitive because it involved making something by hand under pressure, more sophisticated because it required thinking about the environment as a resource rather than a backdrop. Ash's team worked together to carve the sled with a combination of fire and ice and physical effort, each Pokemon contributing what it specifically could do, and the result was an object that represented collective capability rather than individual strength. Naval Island itself was depicted as a place of altitude and cold, unusual for the tropical Orange Archipelago, its summit often above the clouds that the lower islands lived beneath. The climate differentiation between the islands of the archipelago was one of the season's more quietly interesting world-building details. The suggestion that the same ocean could contain environments as different as a tropical beach and a near-alpine peak, each with its own Pokemon ecology and its own human culture, adapted to the specific conditions. The people Danny interacted with on the mountain moved differently from the coastal islanders who appeared elsewhere in the season, more deliberate, more acclimatized to physical difficulty, and that difference in bearing was part of what made the world feel genuinely large. The battle between Ash and Rudy on Trevita Island was structured differently from the other gym encounters, and from most battles the show had depicted, with Rudy fielding Pokemon that matched the types of Ash's challengers one for one, creating a situation where type advantage was eliminated and the contest came down to technique, experience, and the quality of the trainer's relationship with each individual Pokemon. Ash's Squirtle faced Rudy's Starmie, his Bulbasaur faced Rudy's Executor, his Pikachu faced Rudy's Electabuzz. In each case, the battle turned not on who had the stronger or faster Pokemon, but on who had trained theirs most effectively and who understood them most completely. The Electabuzz versus Pikachu battle was the most charged of the three encounters, both literally and narratively, a clash between two electric specialists with no type advantage to determine the outcome. What determined it was the particular quality of Pikachu's thunder attack in the moment it needed to matter most, a move delivered at full power with the conviction that comes from a long and deeply established partnership and the willingness to wait for exactly the right moment rather than attacking continuously and hoping something landed. The orange badge at Trevita felt differently earned from the ones that had preceded it, more personal in some way, more directly connected to the question of who Ash was as a trainer rather than what strategies he had deployed. Luana on Kumquat Island was a mother as well as a gym leader, and the episode that presented her challenge was the only one in the season to place a gym leader's personal life directly in the context of the competition. Her son, a young boy named Remo, who had grown up on the island under the influence of his mother's approach to Pokemon training, was present throughout the challenge in a way that complicated its emotional texture. The double battle format Luana used was something she had developed over years of training, a style she had made her own through practice, and watching Ash adapt to it in real time while aware of being watched not just by a competitor, but by a parent teaching her child what good Pokemon battling looks like, was the episode's most interesting undercurrent. The Pokemon Ash used in the Kumquat double battle were Pikachu and Charizard, a pairing that would have been impossible earlier in the season because Charizard's willingness to follow Ash's directions had only been established at a specific point in the narrative and had not yet been tested in a high stakes context with another Pokemon depending on its cooperation. That the pairing worked, that Charizard responded to Ash's commands and coordinated with Pikachu in ways that a truly uncooperative Charizard would never have managed, was not just a tactical success, but a demonstration of how the relationship between them had shifted and what that shift made possible. The Luana battle was, among other things, a proof of concept for the version of Ash and Charizard that had come into existence after the cold night on the mountainside. The Pomelo Stadium, where the Orange League Championship was held, was the most formally constructed competitive space in the season, a proper arena with designated spectator areas and official match rules, and the particular atmosphere of a contest that has been happening for long enough to have developed its own traditions. Drake, the supreme commander of the Orange Crew, was visually and behaviorally distinct from the island gym leaders who had preceded him, less idiosyncratic and more formal, carrying himself with the composed authority of someone whose position is the result of sustained excellence rather than personal eccentricity. Drake's team was his statement of what the Orange Islands produced in terms of Pokemon training at its highest level, and it included types and species that reflected the specific ecology of the archipelago rather than being simply the strongest available options. His Ditto, which could transform into a copy of whatever Pokemon it faced, created a particularly interesting challenge for Ash, requiring him to defeat a mirror image of his own Pokemon using the same Pokemon it was imitating. That kind of recursive contest, where the strength of your own Pokemon is simultaneously your opponent's strength, tests something that raw power cannot resolve, specifically the tactical intelligence, to find a genuine difference between what looks identical. Ash's strategy against Drake's Ditto relied on Pikachu's speed and its ability to land a precise electric attack in the window created by the transformation sequence, the moment when the Ditto had committed to a form but had not yet fully settled into it. It was a small window. It required Ash to watch very carefully for it and to direct Pikachu's response with more precision than most battles demanded. The fact that Ash caught it and used it correctly was not a given. It was the result of everything the season had been building, the attention developed through the Orange Island Gym challenges, the precision trained in the water pistol contests, the willingness to wait for exactly the right moment rather than acting continuously. The progress of the Drake battle was recorded in the responses of the watching crowd, who understood what they were seeing well enough to react to its significant moments, with the particular quality of appreciation that distinguishes a knowledgeable audience from a general one. They fell quiet at the moments of genuine tension and erupted with the genuine surprise of people who had expected Drake to win and were watching something unexpected happen in real time. Their presence was not merely atmospheric. It was a kind of testimony to the quality of the contest, the living evidence that what was happening on the field was extraordinary. Dragonite's appearance as Drake's final Pokemon was the season's climactic visual moment, the largest and most imposing creature Ash had faced in the competition, filling the arena with a presence that made everything that had come before feel smaller by comparison. Drake's Dragonite was not simply powerful, it was experienced, carrying itself with the ease of a creature that has been in many battles and expects to win them. Against it, Pikachu looked small and the challenge looked enormous, and the show held that disproportion for long enough that the eventual outcome felt genuinely uncertain rather than inevitable. The thunderbolt that decided the Drake battle was not the flashiest move Pikachu had ever used. It was not the longest or the loudest. It was simply perfectly placed and perfectly timed, delivered in the single moment when Drake's Dragonite had overextended and could not bring its defensive capabilities to bear quickly enough. Ash saw the moment coming before it arrived and directed Pikachu into position to use it. That anticipation, that reading of the battle slightly ahead of where it currently was the skill the season had been quietly developing in him through every gym challenge and every ocean crossing, and seeing it deployed at the championship level gave the victory its particular emotional weight. The trophy ceremony following the Drake battle was brief and a little formal, as such ceremonies tend to be, but the shot of Ash holding the trophy with Pikachu on his shoulder and the orange islands spread behind them in the late afternoon light was held long enough to breathe. The season understood that its audience had traveled a long way with these characters through these islands and deserved a moment to stand still in the achievement before the next movement began. Those held moments, the pauses after significant things have happened, are often what audiences remember most clearly, because they are the moments when the story stops rushing and simply exists. The trip back to Pallet Town carried the particular quality of returns, the way that familiar things look different after time away from them. Ash's relationship with his hometown was not complicated in the way that such relationships become complicated in stories about characters who have grown beyond the places that formed them. He loved Pallet Town with the uncomplicated warmth of someone who left it, not because it was insufficient, but because the world outside it was interesting and he wanted to see it. Returning to it felt like completion rather than retreat, and the people who had stayed behind during the journey, his mother, Professor Oak, the Pokémon in Oak's paddock, all of them received him with the welcome that completion deserves. Delia's response to the Orange League trophy was handled with a particular kind of humor that had been established in the show's early episodes and continued to characterize her parental relationship with Ash's achievements. She was proud of him, that was never in doubt, but she expressed pride through a quality of deflection that was both comic and warm, finding ways to incorporate his accomplishments into the ordinary life of the home rather than treating them as exceptions to it. The trophy as dumbbell was a moment of that kind, gentle in its absurdity, belonging to a version of parenthood that understood that too much ceremony around a child's achievements can be its own kind of pressure. Professor Oak's reception of the GS ball at the season's end was warmer and more interested than it might have been, given that the object had been circulating through the story for an entire season without revealing any of its secrets. He held it with the particular quality of attention that genuine scientific curiosity generates, the sense of someone for whom not knowing something is not a frustration, but an invitation. His plan to take it to Kurt and Johto was the kind of practical, patient response to a mystery that characterized his approach to research generally. The recognition that some questions require different contexts and different expertise than the ones immediately available, and that finding the right place to ask a question is itself a form of progress. Tracy's formal installation as Professor Oak's assistant was accomplished in a single conversation, but implied a great deal about what would follow. Oak's laboratory was a place where Tracy's particular combination of observational patience and deep affection for Pokémon would be genuinely useful rather than merely pleasant, where his sketchbooks would become part of a larger documentation effort rather than simply a personal record. The laboratory had always been depicted as a space of genuine inquiry, and adding Tracy to it felt like adding the right piece to an existing structure, something that fits, not because it completed the shape, but because it extended it in a direction the shape had always been reaching toward. The Gary encounter that ended the season was compressed enough to feel deliberately abrupt, the competitive defeat arriving without preamble and resolving without consolation. Gary's Eevee defeating Pikachu was a statement about where Ash was relative to the best available competition outside the structures he had been trained in, a reminder that the Orange League, while genuine, had prepared him for a particular environment, and that the wider competitive world extended far beyond it. The defeat was not cruel, it was accurate, and Gary's composure during and after the battle was itself a kind of information, showing a version of the rival who had matured beyond the need to be unkind about winning, which was its own measure of how much time had passed. What Gary represented at the end of the Orange Island season was not simply a competitive challenge, but a direction. The evidence that the Johto region contained levels of competition that Ash had not yet experienced and would need to develop further in order to reach. The information about Gary's Johto journey, delivered through Professor Oak as the season concluded, was the show's way of establishing the stakes for what came next without requiring a detailed preview, simply placing the rival on the next horizon and letting Ash's response to that information carry the season forward into its successor. Ash's vow to challenge the Johto League was made in the particular tone that characterized his best moments, not the overheated declarations of his early training days, but the quieter resolve of someone who has accomplished something real and wants to discover what the next real thing requires of him. He did not claim to be ready, he claimed to want to try, which is a different and more honest kind of claim. The distinction between readiness and willingness was one that Orange Island's season had clarified over its many episodes, teaching through repeated experience that willingness plus preparation could be brought to bear on challenges that pure readiness might have made seem unnecessary. The three of them, Ash and Misty and Brock, reunited and looking toward Johto, were not the same people who had stood at the beginning of the Orange Islands season. Misty had been a companion through something complete, not a transition or an interruption, but a full arc with its own satisfactions and losses and learnings. Brock had been away and returned, and been integrated back into the group with the ease of someone who belonged there so naturally that his absence had only clarified his presence. Ash had won something for the first time, genuinely won it, and was carrying that experience not as certainty but as evidence, the record of what he could do when everything aligned. The Johto region lay beyond the frame, as all next things do. The Orange Islands settled into the past behind the group with the particular quality of places that leave impressions rather than scars, warm in the memory and slightly luminous, the way that places are when you were young in them and the light was good and the company was right. The coral badges and the crystal caves and the wide ocean and the young Lapras swimming home, all of it settling slowly down through the layers of experience into the permanent record of things that happened and mattered and remain. The Orange Island season was not trying to be the largest thing in the Pokémon anime. It understood its scale and inhabited it honestly. It was a season about open water and small islands and the particular quality of journeys that have no fixed path. It was about a young trainer learning to read a battle slightly ahead of where it was. It was about a Pokemon watcher filling sketchbooks with the record of what he saw. It was about a young Lapras finding its way home. It was about Charizard, cold and stubborn on a mountain, being kept warm through the night by the one person who refused to leave. Another quiet detail appears when one considers how the season understood its own temporality, the sense it maintained throughout of existing in a particular seasonal window, a stretch of warm months that had a beginning and would have an end. The Orange Islands were summer Pokemon, not just in the literal climate sense, but in the narrative sense, the feeling of a story that knows it is taking place in the warmest and most expansive moment before the tighter structures of autumn reimpose themselves. That quality of generous warmth pervaded everything, from the color palette of the islands to the pacing of the gym challenges to the unhurried quality of the ocean journeys between them. Summer, in the sense the Orange Islands embodied, was not simply heat and light, but a particular relationship with time, the sense that the present moment has room in it, that there is enough of it for observation and for detour and for the small pleasures that get squeezed out when urgency takes over. Tracy's sketching was a summer activity in this sense. So was the long morning that Ash spent keeping Charizard warm by the ocean. So was the patient waiting in the Lapras reunion scene, the willingness to let the reunion happen at its own pace, rather than rushing it toward the moment of separation. Summer is when you let things take the time they need. The season's relationship with loss was handled with the same unhurried quality. Things ended in the Orange Islands, relationships concluded, Pokemon moved on, companions found their places, but none of these endings arrived with the drama of things torn away. They came instead with the quality of things released, let go by mutual understanding, rather than forced apart by circumstance. Lapra was the clearest example of this, but it was present throughout in smaller ways, in every goodbye at every harbor and every island where Ash and his companions stayed long enough to care about the place before moving on. The accumulated goodbyes of the Orange Islands season composed a kind of education in leaving, which is its own important skill in a series built around constant travel. Kanto had taught Ash the excitement of arrival. The Orange Islands taught him the practice of departure, the way that caring about a place or a being does not require you to stay attached to it indefinitely, that you can love something fully in the time you are given with it and then release it without that release diminishing what the time meant. Lapras swimming into the school was not a loss, it was a completion. The sea at night in the Orange Islands, depicted occasionally in episodes that ran through the evening hours, had a quality entirely different from the daytime ocean. The water turned dark, and the stars appeared with a density that the artificial lighting of Kanto towns had always obscured, and the sense of scale that the night sky introduced changed the proportion of everything. Ash and Tracy, sitting on Lapras's shell in the dark ocean with the stars overhead and the islands a soft, darker blue against the dark blue sky, that image contained something about the relationship between a person and the world they are traveling through that no amount of competitive action could have communicated. The world was very large, the boat was very small. The direction was roughly right, and the stars helped. That was enough. The Pokemon who appeared briefly and memorably in the Orange Islands, not as recurring cast members, but as single episode presences that left an impression and then receded, were handled with unusual care. The crystal onyx existed in its cave and then disappeared back into it, the encounter complete and nothing carried forward except Tracy's sketches and whatever the young glassblower made from the inspiration. The Merrill population that Ash encountered on one island appeared in their habitat with the casual authenticity of wild animals going about their lives in a place that had not been arranged for a visitor's convenience. The Hitmonchan, whose trainer was using it to mine for gems, appeared strange at first, and then perfectly logical once the situation was understood, Pokemon doing work that fit their capabilities in contexts that had nothing to do with battle. These episodic Pokemon encounters accumulated into a broader portrait of what the Orange Islands meant as a wildlife environment, a place where humans and Pokemon had developed working relationships suited to the specific conditions of island life. Fishermen worked with water-type Pokemon in ways that Kanto's more continental culture had less occasion to develop. Farmers on agricultural islands used ground-type and grass-type Pokemon with a practical intimacy that came from generations of cohabitation. The pirate hunters who controlled certain water routes had relationships with their Pokemon that were functional in a different and occasionally darker way, but which still reflected the fundamental principle that on these islands, humans and Pokemon had found ways to be genuinely useful to each other. The season's final episodes moved with the quality of something that knows it is ending and is not trying to prevent it. The pace slowed slightly. The scenes held their spaces a little longer. The conversations between characters had the warmth of people who are aware of being together in a way that will not last indefinitely and are choosing to inhabit it consciously. Ash's farewell to Lapras was part of this, but so was the quieter series of small moments that preceded it: the last meals on islands, the last mornings on the water, the last sunsets that the show allowed the camera to simply rest on rather than cutting away before the light was done. That attentiveness to endings is one of the gifts a season can give to its audience: the permission to feel the conclusion coming and to stand still in it rather than racing ahead to what comes next. The Orange Island season earned that attentiveness through everything that had preceded it, through the careful accumulation of warm detail and genuine connection that made the ending feel like the end of something real rather than the end of a plot. Real things ending feel different from plots concluding, and the Orange Islands is at its best understood the difference. The story of Pokemon Season 2, Adventures in the Orange Islands, was not the loudest chapter in a long series. It was not the one with the most legendary Pokemon or the most dramatically staged battles or the highest competitive stakes. It was the warm season, the one between two larger things, the one that understood the value of open water and careful observation and letting things take the time they needed. It was the one where Ash learned precision, where Tracy filled his sketchbooks, where Lapras found its way home, where Charizard chose to be present, where the GS ball passed from hand to hand without ever explaining itself, where the coral badges accumulated one by one until the trophy was real and held. There is a particular kind of knowledge that accumulates not through instruction, but through sustained exposure to things that require patience. The Orange Islands taught Ash this kind of knowledge, the kind that cannot be summarized in advice or reduced to a list of principles, the kind that only comes from being in a place long enough that it has time to change you in ways you cannot entirely track or measure. Kanto had been instructional in the way of formal education, each gym battle a structured test of specific capabilities, each town a lesson in some particular aspect of the Pokemon world. The Orange Islands were instructional in a different way, more like apprenticeship, more like the slow learning of a craft through practice without a fixed curriculum. The craft in question was attentiveness, and it showed up in every context the season offered. It showed up in the way Ash watched Drake's Dragonite for the moment of overextension. It showed up in the way he directed Pikachu during the Meekin Island accuracy contest, reading small cues and making tiny adjustments in real time. It showed up in the way he kept Charizard warm through the night, without knowing whether the gesture would matter, doing it anyway, because it was the right thing to do, regardless of the outcome. Attentiveness as a practice, attentiveness as a form of care, attentiveness as a competitive skill. The Orange Islands turned these three versions of the same quality into a coherent lesson delivered across more than 30 episodes. Tracy modeled a different aspect of the same quality. His attentiveness was purely observational, practiced without any competitive application, directed toward Pokemon in their natural behaviors rather than in the context of battle. Watching Tracy sketch was watching someone for whom looking carefully at something was itself a complete and sufficient activity, not a preliminary to doing something else. His sketchbooks were full of observations that had no immediate practical use: drawings of the way a school of Goldeen moved through a reef channel, the posture of a resting Snorlax in the shade of a large fruit tree, the particular shape that Lapras made in the water when it accelerated suddenly. These observations existed for their own sake, because the thing observed was worth the care of being observed. That philosophy, that some things are worth careful attention simply because they exist and are interesting, was not the dominant philosophy of the Pokemon training world as the show depicted it. Training was oriented toward competitive performance, toward the development of capabilities that would be useful in battles. Observation that did not serve that goal was not typically valued by the structures the show presented, the gyms and leagues and tournaments that organized the world of Pokemon competition. Tracy's presence in the season was a gentle and consistent argument for a different valuation, one that placed the intrinsic interest of the world above its competitive utility, and one that found its natural home not on the battlefield, but in Professor Oak's laboratory at the season's end. The laboratory itself was one of the show's most carefully realized recurring locations, a place that balanced the excitement of scientific inquiry with the warmth of genuine affection for the creatures being studied. Professor Oak moved through it with the ease of someone who has lived and worked in a place long enough that it has become an extension of his thought, the shelves and instruments and observation windows all arranged according to a logic that was entirely his own. Adding Tracy to that environment felt right, because Tracy's particular quality of patient observation was exactly what a research environment built around the study of Pokemon needed, someone whose primary skill was seeing things accurately and recording them faithfully. The question of what Ash would take from the Orange Islands into Johto was a question the season left partly open. He had the trophy and the experience and the coral badges and the new relationship with Charizard and the memory of Lapras and the knowledge of what Drake's Dragonite had felt like to face. He had whatever the water pistol contest had taught him about precision, whatever the mountain race had taught him about using environmental resources, whatever the double battle had taught him about coordinating two Pokemon who each had their own relationship with him and each other. He had the education of the warm season. What he did not have was certainty, which is not a limitation, but a condition. Certainty is what comes after, if it comes at all. What you carry into the next challenge is the record of how you faced the previous ones and the particular quality of readiness that that record generates. Ash carried into Johto a record of genuine accomplishment in a genuine competition against genuine opponents, which was more than he had carried into Kanto after Indigo Plateau. The difference was not enormous, but it was real, and it would make itself felt in ways neither he nor the audience could yet anticipate. The GS Ball's ongoing mystery as it passed into Johto with Ash and then eventually out of the story without resolution was not a failure of the narrative, but a feature of how large stories actually work. Some threads are established and then not followed, not because the storytellers forgot about them, but because the world being depicted is larger than any single story's resolution capacity, and acknowledging that limitation honestly is more truthful than taking everything away. The GS Ball was a mystery that remained a mystery, which is the appropriate fate for most mysteries when you are honest about them. That it was beautiful and strange and persistent without ever explaining itself was, in a way, a small model for the Orange Islands season as a whole. The season that came between two larger things managed to be, in its own gentle and unhurried way, something that mattered on its own terms. Not because it contained the most dramatic confrontations or introduced the most significant Pokemon or moved the largest narrative pieces, but because it inhabited its particular place in the world with the kind of care and attention that makes any place feel real, and because it told its story with the patience of something that trusted its audience to stay with it without needing to be shouted at or rushed. That trust was returned, as trust generally is when it is genuine. The islands are warm in the memory, the water is blue, and the coral badges are the color of things found in tide pools. Lapras swims in a current that is always slightly warmer than the air above it. Tracy's pencil moves across paper in the early light. Ash stands at the prow of a boat he is too small for, looking at a horizon he is heading toward, carrying the GS ball and the memory of everything that brought him to this particular moment in this particular stretch of warm ocean. He does not yet know what comes next. He is not supposed to. That is exactly where the story is supposed to leave him, pointed outward with sufficient experience behind him to move forward and sufficient uncertainty ahead to make the moving forward matter. That is the gift of the in between season, the gift of the warm water and the open archipelago, and the unhurried pace of learning that does not know it is learning until it looks back and sees what it has become. And in the looking back, the Orange Islands resolve into something specific and clear and worth the time it took to inhabit them. A corner of the Pokémon world that was precisely itself and nothing else, warm and real and given its due care. The story that happened there happened completely. The people who were changed by it were changed in directions that would take them further than the islands could show. The quiet of an ended story settles slowly, not all at once. The details linger past the moments. The warmth persists after the light has moved on. The Orange Islands were a warm season in a long series, and warm seasons that leave a particular quality of impression, not the sharpest or the deepest, but the most consistently available when you go looking for it. The memory of being comfortable in a place and in a time, and with people who were exactly the right company for the particular journey being taken. Ash Ketchum left the Orange Islands slightly different from the person who arrived, not transformed, not completed, slightly different in the way that genuine experience makes a person slightly different, adjusted in small ways towards something that is still in the process of becoming clear. The direction was right, the pace was honest. The water behind the boat disappeared into the flat blue line of the horizon as Pallet Town appeared on the coast ahead, and the warm season concluded in the warm light of a late afternoon that was neither dramatic nor ordinary, but simply present, simply real, simply the end of one thing and the beginning of the space before the next. There is something the Orange Island season did with sound that deserves its own consideration. Though sound in an animated series is never entirely separable from image, and the two work together in ways that individual analysis tends to understate. The music that accompanied the ocean sequences was different from the music that had underscored the Kanto adventures, lighter in texture and warmer in tone, built around acoustic instruments and open harmonies that suggested space rather than tension. It was music that understood it was accompanying a journey through an archipelago rather than through a region of roads, music that breathed differently and paused differently and knew when to step back entirely and let the sound of water do the work. The sound of water in the Orange Island season was used more deliberately than in any previous season of the show. The sound of Lapras moving through the ocean, the gentle displacement, and the slight rhythm of effort was allowed to be audible in sequences where other shows would have filled the space with underscore. The lapping of small waves against the hulls of boats, the muffled ambient sound of being below deck in a harbor, the particular quality of silence that sits above deep open ocean when the wind has dropped and nothing is moving quickly. These are the sounds of a place, the sounds that tell you where you are when the image is not enough on its own, and the Orange Islands season used them with the care of a production that understood their value. The visual language of the season was built around the horizon in a way that Kanto's more terrestrial aesthetics never quite required. The horizon over flat water is a specific and particularly powerful visual element because it is simultaneously the limit of visible space and the promise of what lies beyond it. Every shot that included the horizon in the Orange Islands carried both of these qualities simultaneously, the limit and the promise, and that combination gave the visual composition of the season a consistent quality of looking towards something that reinforced the narrative without needing to state it explicitly. Ash's silhouette against the horizon appeared at significant narrative moments with the deliberate quality of a visual motif being used consciously. The opening shot of his journey toward the Orange Islands, the moment after the Drake battle, when he stood at the edge of the Pumelo Stadium with the wind still settling into him, the departure from the island where Lapras rejoined its school, watching the school move away across open water. Each of these horizon shots placed the figure of the young trainer in the context of the larger world he was moving through, small against the scale of what surrounded him, but present and pointed in a direction. That combination of smallness and directionality was the visual grammar the season returned to whenever it wanted to summarize something about where Ash was in relation to his journey. He was small against the world, which was true, and he was pointed at it, which was also true, and neither of those truths canceled the other. The world was large, and he was heading into it anyway, which is the basic condition of any genuine journey and the fundamental truth of the character the show had spent 2 seasons establishing. The islands themselves were given particular visual personalities that distinguished them from each other in ways that helped the audience understand the archipelago as a diverse environment rather than a uniform setting. Mikan Island was low and coastal, dominated by the colors of shallow water and sandy flats. Naval Island rose steeply with the distinctive vertical profile of a volcanic peak, its summit frequently obscured by cloud. Trevita Island had the rugged quality of a place that had been shaped primarily by the ocean rather than by any internal geological event, its coastline jagged and complex. Kumquat Island was lush and densely vegetated, the kind of island that receives enough rainfall to support heavy growth and where the natural world presses against every cleared space with the patience of something that knows it will eventually reclaim everything. Pumelo Island, where the championship was held, was depicted as the most formally developed of the islands, with the stadium and the administrative infrastructure of a competitive venue giving it a more institutional quality than the other islands had carried. It was the Orange Islands, at their most organized, the place where the informal and idiosyncratic culture of the archipelago had been arranged into something that looked more like what competitive Pokémon training looked like in Kanto, with stands and flags and the formal structure of an officially recognized league. The contrast between Pumelo and the smaller islands was not incidental. It was the difference between the wild and the organized, between the place where the journey happened and the place where it was measured. The episode in which Ash helped a young sailor whose boat had run aground on a reef during an unexpected storm was one of the season's quieter successes, a standalone story that had no bearing on the badge collecting arc, but that illuminated something important about the kind of person Ash was becoming through his time in the islands. He helped because helping was the obvious thing to do, and the quality of his help was practical and effective in ways that would not have been possible earlier in his journey. He knew which Pokemon to use for which part of the problem. He coordinated the effort without needing to consult anyone. He stayed until the boat was free and the sailor was safe, and then accepted gratitude with the mild embarrassment of someone who did not feel that ordinary helpfulness required particular acknowledgement. That quality of practical competence in service of other people was one of the things the Orange Islands built in Ash alongside the competitive skills that the gym challenges developed. The islands were not simply a proving ground for trainers. They were an environment where Pokemon and their trainers were genuinely useful in the daily lives of the people who lived there, and spending time in that environment had made Ash better at the practical applications of his training than he had been when he arrived. He was not just learning to win battles, he was learning to be genuinely helpful in a world where that distinction mattered. The fishing communities on some of the islands provided a context in which water type Pokemon were integrated into daily economic life in ways that had nothing to do with competitive training. The fishermen who worked the reef channels used Pokemon as partners in a genuinely mutual enterprise, the Pokemon helping to locate and herd fish, while the fishermen ensured the Pokemon were well fed and well cared for. Ash watched these working relationships with the interest of someone encountering a version of the trainer Pokemon bond that operated on different principles from the ones he had been taught, and what he saw clearly affected the way he thought about his own relationship with his team. The relationship between Ash and Pikachu had been the emotional center of the show since its first episode, and the Orange Islands season continued to develop it with the patient attention of a production that understood the relationship was the show's most important ongoing element. Pikachu was always with Ash, always perched on his shoulder or walking beside him or sitting next to him in quiet moments, and the show used that constant presence to communicate something that explicit scenes would have made too large. The closeness was simply the background condition of every moment, the thing that was always true, regardless of what else was happening. That reliability was itself a form of warmth, the particular warmth of something that does not need to be performed because it is simply present. There were moments in the Orange Island season when Pikachu's emotional state became narratively significant in ways that went beyond its function as a battle partner. The moment when Pikachu was ill in an early episode, and the urgency that illness generated in Ash was one of these. The quick panic of someone who has realized that what they love is fragile, and that fragility is not abstract, but immediate and real. The relief when Pikachu recovered was handled without sentimentality, but with genuine warmth. The particular quality of relief that comes after genuine fear, not the theatrical relief of a dramatic resolution, but the quiet exhaling kind that happens when the thing you were afraid of does not happen after all. The dynamic between Ash and Tracy around Pikachu was interesting for the light it cast on how different people can have affection for the same creature in entirely different ways. Tracy's affection for Pikachu was observational, the interest of someone who found the electric mouse genuinely fascinating as a subject of study and as a personality. He sketched Pikachu in various poses and noted its behaviors with the same attention he gave to wild Pokemon in their natural environments, but without the detachment that study can sometimes impose. His care for Pikachu was real. It was simply expressed differently from Ash's care, through attention rather than through the particular urgency that comes from ownership and partnership. That difference in how care was expressed between Ash and Tracy was one of the season's more quietly interesting character contrasts, and it was maintained consistently enough to feel true rather than convenient. Ash's care for his Pokemon was expressed through action, through the decisions he made in battles and in crises, through the way he stayed with Charizard through the cold night and refused to give up on Lapras finding its family. Tracy's care was expressed through seeing, through the accumulated record in his sketchbooks of what he had observed and found worth preserving. Both of these were genuine forms of care. They simply inhabited different registers. Misty's care to complete the picture was expressed primarily through the ongoing daily attentiveness of someone who notices when others need things before they ask for them. She was the one who noticed that Togepi was missing before anyone else realized it was gone. She was the one who recognized when Ash was tiring in a battle before he would have admitted it. She was the one who managed the small logistics of traveling life, the meals and the resting places and the navigation decisions that kept the group functioning smoothly. This kind of care is often invisible because it succeeds in its primary goal of preventing problems rather than solving them, which means there is nothing dramatic to point to. But its absence would have been felt immediately, and the show's occasional acknowledgement of its presence was one of the ways it honored Misty's particular contribution to the traveling group. The traveling group as a social unit was one of the show's most durable and successful inventions, and the Orange Island season tested it by altering its composition at both ends. The removal of Brock and his replacement by Tracy created a different internal dynamic without disrupting the fundamental character of the group. Ash remained the driving force, oriented toward competition and forward movement. Misty remained the practical voice, the one most likely to introduce the reality check that adventure often requires. The third position, occupied first by Brock and then by Tracy, was the supporting voice, the one who provided context and expertise without competing with either of the other two for narrative centrality. What Brock brought to that position was warmth and domestic competence, the ability to make a camp comfortable and a meal satisfying, and a difficult situation feel manageable through the application of reasonable, practical knowledge. What Tracy brought was different, a quality of wonder at the world, an insistence that what they were moving through deserved to be looked at carefully and recorded. These were complementary rather than equivalent, and the shift between them gave the season a slightly different emotional texture from the first season without changing its fundamental character. Both versions of the trio worked because both honored the basic dynamic that the show had established from the beginning. Two things remaining constant, while one thing changed, and change generating renewed attention to what had remained. The Orange Islands season also introduced the concept of regional differences in Pokémon in a way that the first season had not fully explored. Nurse Joy's Chansey on the mainland were replaced in some island clinics by different species, performing the same healthcare functions, a detail that suggested the Orange Islands had developed their own institutional structures adapted to the local Pokémon ecology. Officer Jenny was present, but worked with Pokémon better suited to maritime law enforcement than the species her mainland counterparts typically employed. These small institutional adaptations accumulated into a picture of the Orange Islands as a genuinely distinct regional culture, one that had developed its own relationship with Pokémon based on the specific conditions of island life, rather than simply importing the mainland model and applying it wholesale. That attention to regional specificity was one of the things that made the Orange Islands feel like a real place rather than a setting. The sense that the culture the travelers moved through had its own logic and its own history that predated their arrival and would continue after their departure. The archipelago had been there, apparently, for long enough that its human and Pokémon communities had developed the kind of intricate mutual adaptation that only comes from generations of cohabitation. The fishermen's relationships with their water-type Pokémon, the farmers' partnerships with species suited to tropical soil and rainfall, the gym leaders' idiosyncratic challenge formats, each one reflecting not just the personal style of the leader, but the particular conditions and resources of their specific island. The Orange League itself in this reading was not simply a competitive structure imposed on the archipelago, but something that had grown out of it, a formalization of values and practices that the island communities had developed organically. Drake's championship was not administered from somewhere else, but located precisely in the archipelago, on an island that was itself a community with its own life beyond the stadium. The competitive structure was embedded in the place rather than floating above it, which gave the championship a quality of belonging that mainland competitions sometimes lacked. That quality of belonging, of things being exactly where they should be, in the specific environment that produced them, was one of the lasting impressions the Orange Islands season left. Everything in it felt located, felt placed correctly in relation to the water and the light and the communities that surrounded it. Ash and his companions moved through this correctly placed world as visitors who were genuinely welcomed rather than merely tolerated, and the welcome was specific rather than generic, oriented toward who they actually were and what they actually needed. What they needed from the Orange Islands was what the Orange Islands gave: a warm season, an open path through warm water, a competition that tested what they had developed rather than what they could have memorized, a companion who watched the world carefully and recorded it faithfully, a young Lapra that knew the way home. There is a quality to the in between hours of the Orange Islands that the season rendered with unusual honesty, the hours between the departure from one island and the arrival at the next, when there was nothing to do but exist on the water. Those hours did not belong to any particular location. They were not the property of Meekin Island, or Neville Island, or Trevita. They were simply time on the open sea, time that the story had to account for, and chose, for the most part, to account for honestly rather than skipping over in a cut. Ash and Tracy and Misty inhabited those hours differently from each other, and watching how each of them used the space of open ocean time revealed something true about who they were when no particular task was demanding their attention. Ash used those hours to think about battles, replaying them internally, returning to moments where a different decision might have produced a different outcome. He was not brooding. He was studying in the only way he knew how, through memory and repetition, returning to the evidence of what had happened and looking for the lesson it contained. Tracy used the hours to draw, sketching the ocean itself when there were no Pokémon visible, capturing the texture of the water under different light conditions, the way that the surface changed color at the boundary between shallow and deep. Misty used them to take care of Togepi, to maintain the equipment they were traveling with, to do the small essential tasks of a journey that would accumulate into serious problems if left unattended. Each of them was precisely themselves in those hours, and the small picture they composed together on the back of a large lapras in the middle of the ocean was one of the season's most honest portraits of what it means to travel with people rather than simply alongside them. The concept of traveling with rather than alongside deserves its own attention. There are journeys where the members of a group share a starting point and a destination, but remain essentially separate in everything between, moving in parallel rather than in genuine connection. The Orange Islands traveling group did not journey this way, and the season's attention to how the three characters occupied shared space during the unstructured hours was part of what demonstrated that they talked about small things. They disagreed about directions. They noticed what each other noticed and commented on it, without needing to make the comment significant. Those small exchanges accumulated into something that felt genuinely inhabited, the particular warmth of a group of people who have been spending most of their time together and have developed the ease that comes from sustained proximity without conflict. That ease was not the absence of friction, but the management of it, the ability to disagree without the disagreement threatening the fundamental arrangement, to be exasperated by someone without wanting to be elsewhere. Misty and Ash disagreed constantly in the particular way of people who have a genuine relationship rather than a performed one, and those disagreements were handled without the artificiality that fictional conflict sometimes carries, the sense that the disagreement exists to serve as a plot point rather than because the people involved actually see things differently. In the Orange Islands, Ash and Misty saw things differently because they were different people, and the differences between them generated heat without ever generating genuine rupture. The Pokemon that Ash had deposited with Professor Oak before the Orange Islands journey created an interesting background presence in the season, a set of capabilities that were unavailable because of the logistics of traveling to a distant archipelago, but that the audience knew existed and occasionally wondered about. Bulbasaur and Squirtle and the others who remained in Pallet Town were not forgotten by the show, but were referenced occasionally in ways that reminded the audience that Ash's team was larger than what he traveled with, and that the choices about which Pokemon to bring and which to leave reflected a kind of curation that the first season had been too chaotic to practice deliberately. The Orange Island's Ash made choices. He was still making them imperfectly, but the act of choosing rather than simply accumulating was itself a form of growth. The episode in which Ash encountered a trainer who had devoted years to perfecting a single move with a single Pokemon was one of the season's quieter arguments about what kind of training philosophy leads to what kind of outcome. The trainer in question had spent an enormous amount of time developing one technique to an extraordinary level of refinement, and the result was genuinely impressive, a degree of precision and power that no generalist approach could have produced. But it was also incomplete, unable to adapt when the conditions changed, vulnerable to anything that fell outside the narrow range the training had prepared for. Ash's response to the encounter was characteristically his own: admiration for the dedication and unease about what had been sacrificed to achieve it, the implicit argument for breadth over depth that had always characterized his approach. That argument, breadth over depth, was embedded in the Orange League itself, in the format that required the trainers to be ready for anything rather than to develop expertise in a single area. The gym leaders were not specialists in a way that could be countered by a targeted team. They were practitioners of idiosyncratic styles that required adaptability to address, and the championship Drake administered required the kind of versatile excellence that only comes from a broad foundation. The format made a philosophical argument through its structure rather than through any explicit statement, and the argument was consistent with what the show was doing with its main character throughout the season, teaching Ash to be useful in situations he had not anticipated. The berry-picking sequences that appeared in several Orange Islands episodes were small, but telling details about the practical reality of traveling through a region with different flora from the mainland. The berries that Ash and his companions used for Pokemon food and recovery in Kanto were not all available in the archipelago, and the local varieties had different properties that required learning before they could be used effectively. Brock's absence was felt most acutely in these moments, because his knowledge of plants and their properties for Pokemon care had been one of the most practically useful things he brought to the group. Tracy's observational training gave him the tools to learn the new varieties reasonably quickly, identifying them through careful examination and cross-referencing with what he knew about Pokemon nutritional needs, but the learning curve was visible in the early episodes, a small, honest acknowledgement that the departure of someone with specific expertise creates a real gap. The water-type Pokemon who populated the Orange Islands in their wild state were depicted with more behavioral specificity than the show had generally managed in Kanto. The Tentacool and Tentacruel that drifted through certain channels moved with the unhurried quality of creatures that knew nothing in the water was faster than they were when threatened. The Horsea and Seadra that appeared near underwater rock formations behaved with the territorial specificity of animals that had established particular spaces as their own. The Magikarp populations that occupied certain harbor areas had the slightly chaotic energy of creatures whose vulnerability made them perpetually alert. These behavioral details were not invented for dramatic purposes, but observed from whatever natural reference the animators were working from, and they accumulated into a portrait of the Orange Islands as an environment where the wildlife had its own logic, independent of the human story happening in its midst. The moment when Ash's Squirtle demonstrated something during an Orange Islands encounter that it could not have done at the beginning of the journey, a precision of water-based maneuver that required both technical control and situational reading, was one of the season's quieter metrics of growth. Squirtle had been evolving as a battler throughout the seasons, not dramatically, but incrementally, through the accumulation of encounters that required slightly more than what it had already learned. Watching it perform something new in the context of a situation that genuinely required it, rather than in a training sequence set up specifically to demonstrate the new capability, was part of how the show honored the logic of its own world. Skills developed in practice when they were needed, not when the plot required them to be revealed. The island that housed an ancient ruin in one of the season's mid arc episodes offered a different kind of Pokemon environment from the living reef systems and coastal habitats that dominated the archipelago. The ruin was old enough that the Pokemon who had made their homes in it had become part of its structure, their presence so long established that the line between creature and habitat had blurred in interesting ways. Slowpoke sat in alcoves that seemed shaped for them, which raised the question of whether the shapes had been made for the slowpoke or had been discovered by the slowpoke and then slowly deepened through generations of occupation. The ruin sequence had the quality of the Orange Islands at its most thoughtful, the willingness to sit with a question that did not have a clean answer and to let the sitting be the point rather than the resolution. The quality of Pokemon Center care in the Orange Islands differed from what Ash had experienced in Kanto in ways that the show noted without dwelling on. The healing technology was the same in principle, the familiar pale light and the gentle mechanical process of restoration, but the Pokemon being healed in island centers sometimes required additional attention because they had been exposed to things that mainland practice had not developed protocols for specific salt concentrations in the water, particular plants with unusual effects, weather patterns that created conditions that required different recovery approaches. Nurse Joy's island counterparts, or sometimes different species performing equivalent functions, navigated these variations with the confident improvisation of practitioners who have encountered enough unusual situations to have become good at recognizing patterns in the unusual. The episodes that followed Ash through the quieter interior spaces of the larger islands, the forests and volcanic slopes that existed behind the coastal zones where most human activity concentrated, had a different quality from the ocean episodes and the harbor town episodes. They were slower and more enclosed, the world pressing in from every side rather than opening to every horizon, and the Pokemon ecology of those interior spaces was correspondingly different from the coastal environment. Bug type and grass type Pokemon appeared in the forest interiors with the confidence of creatures that knew they were in the right place, and the fire type species associated with volcanic areas had the particular ease of animals who had made their peace with conditions that excluded most other things. Tracy's sketchbook documentation of these interior spaces was some of the season's most interesting visual content. The careful record of environments that were not dramatic in the way that ocean confrontations or stadium battles were dramatic, but that contained their own kind of density. He sketched the way that light came through canopy in the tropical forests, the specific angles that the trees permitted, and how those angles affected which Pokemon preferred which locations beneath them. He sketched the heat shimmer up a volcanic rock and the Pokemon who basked in that shimmer with the patient absorption of creatures that had evolved to make use of warmth that would have been hostile to anything less specifically adapted. Those sketches were not included in the season in any formal sense, but their existence was implied by the documentation practice that defined Tracy's character, and imagining them was part of what gave his presence in the group its particular texture. The relationship between the Orange Islands and the broader global Pokemon world was gestured at occasionally through the international trainers who passed through the archipelago's ports on their own journeys. The Orange Islands sat in a navigational position that made them a natural waypoint for trainers traveling between regions, and the harbor towns of the larger islands sometimes contained travelers who were neither residents nor challengers but simply passing through on their way to somewhere else. Those figures appeared in background conversations and brief exchanges that implied the existence of a larger world of Pokemon training that the show had not yet depicted, journeys with different destinations and different structures and different things at stake than the Orange League that Ash was working toward. The concept of a journey with no fixed destination, which those passing through figures implied, was something the Orange Islands season circled without ever making explicitly its subject. Ash had a goal, the 4 badges and the championship, but the path to that goal was genuinely open in a way that Kanto's linear gym circuit had not been, and that openness created space for detours that felt organic rather than engineered. When the group stopped somewhere interesting that was not on any direct path to the next badge, the stop did not feel like an interruption of the real story, but like part of the texture of what the season was actually about, which was the experience of being in this particular place, at this particular time, with these particular people. Another quiet detail appears when we look closely at how the season depicted the passage of actual time across its episodes, the way that light shifted from morning to afternoon to evening in the outdoor sequences, the way that the color palette of the ocean changed with the position of the sun. Most animated series of the era treated time of day as a background detail, something present in the establishing shot, and then forgotten as the episode progressed. The Orange Islands season was more attentive than this, tracking the time of day through episodes in ways that occasionally meant an action sequence happened in the low orange light of late afternoon rather than the convenient brightness of television's default eternal midday. Those lighting choices were small and might not have been noticed consciously by most viewers, but they accumulated into a sense of the world as something that moved through time rather than existing in perpetual narrative present. The thermal systems of the deeper ocean that Lapras occasionally navigated through produced water temperature variations that the show used as environmental storytelling. Cold currents rising from depth brought different Pokémon to the surface, species that normally lived at greater depth but that followed the cold upwellings because those currents concentrated the food sources they depended on. Ash and Tracy encountered species in those cold upwelling zones that did not appear elsewhere in the season, brief presences that implied a vertical depth to the ocean ecology that the surface dwelling sequences could only gesture at. The oceans in the Orange Islands was not just a horizontal expanse, but a vertical one, and the creatures who lived at different depths were as different from each other as the creatures who lived on different islands. The cultural practices of the Orange Islands people that appeared across the season's various island communities were handled with the care of a production that wanted to make the archipelago feel genuinely inhabited rather than generically tropical. Different islands had different traditions around their relationships with Pokemon, different festivals, and different taboos, and different ways of marking the transitions of the natural calendar. One island held an annual ceremony at the time of the Magikarp migration through its local waters. Another maintained a tradition of allowing certain wild Pokemon to roam freely through the town during a specific period each year, a practice so old that the town's architecture had been adapted to accommodate the creatures rather than the creatures being required to navigate around the architecture. These details accumulated without being foregrounded, present in background conversations and visual details rather than made the explicit subject of any episode's plot. The relationship between the Orange Islands human communities and the natural world they inhabited was not the relationship of people who had conquered their environment, but of people who had found ways to live within it. The islands were not extensively developed, not cleared and built upon in the way of mainland cities, but inhabited at the margins, with the natural Pokemon habitats and human spaces existing in proximity rather than in opposition. That proximity was sometimes inconvenient, sometimes genuinely difficult, but it was also the basis for the working relationships between humans and Pokemon that gave the archipelago its distinctive character. The people had chosen accommodation over domination, and the resulting culture had a quality of ease with the natural world that Kanto's more urbanized communities had largely lost. The fishing community on one of the smaller islands that Ash passed through was the clearest example of this accommodation. A group of people whose entire economy was built around reading the natural patterns of the ocean rather than imposing human patterns onto it. They fished so when the fish were present, following the movement of the schools, rather than setting up stationary operations and waiting for the fish to come to them. Their Pokemon partners, the water types who helped them locate and guide the schools, were treated with the respect of genuine colleagues rather than the instrumental regard of tools, and the Pokemon responded to this treatment with the particular kind of cooperative engagement that comes from mutual trust rather than mere conditioning. Ash watched one of the fishermen work with his Kingler for an afternoon, and what he saw was a collaboration so practiced and so fluent that it had ceased to require explicit communication. The fisherman and the Kingler moved together through the coastal water with the ease of two parts of a single system, each anticipating the other's next action from long familiarity rather than from instruction. Ash recognized in this working partnership something that his own relationship with Pikachu was in the process of becoming, not fully there yet, but visible in the direction of travel, and the recognition was one of those quiet moments the season offered that said more about where the character was headed than any battle outcome could have. The geological diversity of the Orange Islands archipelago extended its influence into the Pokemon ecology in ways the show used consistently but without explanation, trusting the audience to understand the connection between environment and inhabitant. Volcanic islands supported fire types that the purely coastal islands lacked. Islands with underground cave systems hosted rock and ground types who would have been out of place in the beach environments that most visitors encountered. The reef systems supported ecological communities that had no exact mainland equivalent, and the deep water channels between islands were home to species that passed through without stopping, their journeys through the archipelago part of larger migration routes that the Orange Islands happened to intersect. Tracy's awareness of this ecological specificity was one of the things that made him a genuinely useful traveling companion rather than simply an agreeable presence. He could recognize when a Pokemon was out of its usual habitat and infer from that displacement that something unusual was occurring, a change in water temperature, a disruption of a food source, the presence of a predator that had moved into territory it did not normally occupy. This ecological reading was a form of intelligence that had nothing to do with battle capability and everything to do with careful attention, and the show used it to give Tracy a contribution that was meaningfully different from anything Ash or Misty brought to the group. The episodes that involved Ash helping to resolve situations where Pokemon and human communities had come into conflict were some of the season's most thoughtful, requiring solutions that were not simply about who was stronger, but about what arrangement could work for everyone involved. The Snorlax Orchard situation was the most extended of these, but smaller versions of the same basic dynamic appeared throughout the season, moments where the question was not how to defeat a Pokemon, but how to find a way for the Pokemon and the people in the same space to coexist without either side suffering unreasonably. Those situations were the Orange Islands, at its most genuinely interesting, using the Pokemon world not as a backdrop for battles, but as a setting for the kind of problem solving that requires understanding rather than power. The way the season handled Ash's occasional failures during these cooperative situations was part of what made them feel honest rather than contrived. He did not always find the right solution immediately. He tried things that did not work and had to reconsider and try differently. The failures were not dramatic, did not create crises that required heroic resolution, but they were real enough to register as genuine rather than perfunctory obstacles on the way to the predetermined successful outcome. A trainer who never fails at anything except the final dramatic confrontation is not a believable trainer. A trainer who sometimes fails at small things and has to figure out why and try again, is someone the audience can actually recognize. The harbor towns of the larger islands were the Orange Islands at their most social, places where different kinds of people and different kinds of journeys intersected. Merchants and fishermen and Pokemon trainers and researchers and people who had simply washed up in the archipelago and stayed because leaving had never seemed necessary all occupied the same harborside streets, and their coexistence generated a social texture that single purpose locations could not produce. Ash and his companions moved through these spaces as visitors who were clearly temporary, identifiable as travelers by their Pokemon and their equipment and the quality of attention they brought to things that the permanent residents had long since stopped noticing, and that visitor perspective was part of what allowed the season to render the harbor towns with the particular clarity of things seen fresh. The qualities of the food in those harbor towns was a detail the show returned to with unusual consistency, as if recognizing that food was one of the most reliable ways to communicate something true about a place. The island cuisine was different from anything Ash had encountered in Kanto, built around seafood and tropical fruit, and preparations that reflected generations of cooks working with what the ocean and the local growing conditions provided rather than with what convenience suggested. The meals that appeared in background shots of harbor restaurants and foreground moments of the group eating together had a specificity of visual detail that went beyond what a story strictly needs, evidence of a production that understood food as culture rather than simply as fuel. The particular pleasures of the Orange Islands accumulated in this way, in the small details that did not demand attention but rewarded it when given. The way the water moved around the bases of sea stacks at the edge of certain islands, the particular call of a wingle species that served in the archipelago the ecological role that more familiar flying types served on the mainland, the texture of the coral that Ash reached for once and was told not to touch by a local child who understood its fragility in a way that a visitor from a landlocked region would not intuitively know. These were the details that made the Orange Islands feel like a place that had existed before the story arrived in it, a place with its own accumulated specificities that the story was visiting rather than inventing. The children who appeared across the season's various island communities were depicted with the particular unself-consciousness of children who grow up in places where the natural world is close and visible rather than managed and distant. They knew things about the local Pokemon ecology that adults who had grown up elsewhere spent years trying to learn, knew them not as information, but as the ordinary background knowledge of daily life, the way any child knows things about the specific place they inhabit, simply from having been in it continuously and paying the ambient attention that childhood pays to everything. When one of these island children corrected Ash's identification of a local water type, the correction was not delivered unkindly, but with the casual certainty of someone for whom the correct identification was so obvious that the mistake was simply interesting rather than embarrassing. Ash's relationship with being corrected had evolved across the seasons in ways that were visible in those small moments. The Ash of early Kanto had bristled at corrections, taking them as challenges to his authority or his competence rather than as information he could use. The Ash of the Orange Islands received them with something closer to genuine interest, the response of someone who had learned that knowing more was better than defending the pretense of already knowing enough. That shift was not dramatized. It was simply present in the small interactions, the way he responded to the island child's correction with a question about what else he had gotten wrong about the local species, rather than with defensiveness or dismissal. The ship routes between islands that Team Rocket occasionally hijacked or disrupted were depicted with enough specificity to feel like actual logistics rather than convenient plot mechanisms. There were regular ferry routes and irregular transport schedules and boats that served specific purposes rather than general passenger movement. And Team Rocket's interference with these systems had consequences that extended beyond the immediate confrontation, affecting islanders who depended on the routes for supplies or communication or the movement of goods between communities. The show did not dwell on these downstream consequences, but their presence was implied in the background of episodes where Team Rocket's schemes were eventually undone, and that implication gave the disruptions a weight that pure comedy would not have carried. Jesse's relationship with the Orange Islands was one of the season's unexamined but quietly present undercurrents. She was someone who wanted things with a particular intensity, who had spent most of her adult life in an organization that had promised her something and consistently failed to deliver it, and who maintained her ambition through sheer force of will despite the evidence that accumulated against its eventual satisfaction. The Orange Islands offered her nothing she had not been offered before, only the same pursuit and the same failures, but she pursued them with the same energy because stopping would have required confronting something she was not yet ready to confront. That quality of determined, somewhat futile persistence was handled with more sympathy than comedy in the season's better episodes, recognizing in Jessie a form of loyalty to her own aspirations that was genuinely moving even when its objects were absurd. James's gentleness was the season's most consistent quiet note in the Team Rocket sequences, the sense of someone for whom the circumstances of his life had never quite matched the person he actually was. He had resources he did not use, connections he had walked away from, a capacity for care that had found its expression in the limited and somewhat improbable context of a life as a low-level criminal. The Orange Islands did not change this, but it provided a backdrop against which his gentleness was occasionally more visible in the episodes set on islands where the pace was slower and the demands less immediate, and the moments between confrontations longer. In those between moments, James could be seen being more fully himself, and what that fuller self contained was mostly a kind of wondering kindness that deserved a better situation than the one it had found itself in. Meowth's narrations, the internal monologues that occasionally gave voice to what he was thinking in moments of particular absurdity or particular melancholy, were one of the season's more interesting formal choices. He was the only character who regularly stepped slightly outside the story to address its logic or comment on its ironies, and this ability to occupy both inside and outside positions simultaneously gave him a perspective that no other character possessed. He was embedded in the Team Rocket dynamic and also capable of observing it from a slight distance, and that dual position was part of what made his presence in the series irreplaceable. The cat who had taught himself to talk in order to become worthy of something that had not wanted him, and who had ended up in a life that was not the one he had aimed for, watching the world from the vantage point of a creature who had worked very hard to be somewhere other than where he was. That was Meowth in the Orange Islands, and it was handled with a lightness that made it bearable. The formal challenge structure of the Orange League created a particular rhythm in the season that alternated between the open texture of travel and the focused intensity of competition. The gym battles provided endpoints that gave the traveling sequences their purpose and their direction, and that alternation between purposeful wandering and structured competition was part of what made the season feel both relaxed and meaningful. A journey with no endpoints at all would have become formless. A journey that was nothing but endpoints would have lost the texture of what travel actually contains. The Orange Islands balanced these two against each other with the particular skill of a narrative that understood what it was doing structurally, even when the audience was too absorbed in the individual moments to notice the structure. The aftermath of each gym battle was handled with more care than the aftermath of Kanto gym battles had generally received. Ash rested. His Pokémon recovered. The group spent time in the island community where the gym was located, sometimes a day and sometimes longer, and during that time, Ash processed what the battle had shown him about where his capabilities stood relative to what the Orange League demanded. That processing was not dramatic or explicit. It happened in the background of ordinary activity, in the quality of his attention during quieter moments, in the small adjustments visible in how he worked with his Pokémon in the days following each challenge. The changes were too small to be the subject of any scene, but were cumulatively significant. The incremental improvement of someone who uses every experience as information. The particular character of each island gym leader was connected to their island in ways that were not always explained, but were consistently present as visual and behavioral details. Sissy's ease on and in the water reflected the coastal character of Mycan Island, a place where the relationship with the ocean was close and constant rather than occasional. Danny's physical confidence at altitude was inseparable from Naval Island's mountainous character, the bearing of someone who had grown up moving through vertical terrain rather than horizontal. Rudy's energy and showmanship were suited to Trevita Island's more populated and socially complex character, a place with enough visitors to have developed a culture of presentation. Luana's warmth and the domestic quality of her gym space reflected Kumquat Island's agricultural and community centered character. Each leader was the distillation of their island as much as they were an individual, and the gym challenges were therefore encounters with place as much as with people. Drake stood slightly apart from this pattern because Pumelo Island was not primarily a community in the way the other islands were, but a venue, a place organized around the championship rather than around any particular way of living. Drake was the distillation of the Orange League itself, of what sustained excellence in the island's competitive tradition looked like when it had been maintained for long enough to become its own kind of character. He was not his island in the way the other gym leaders were their islands. He was the end point of a system, the final expression of what the Orange Crew existed to produce, and that positioning gave him a different quality from the other leaders, more formal and less idiosyncratic, the particular gravity of someone who represents something larger than themselves. The trophy that Ash received after the Drake battle had a visual design that reflected the Orange Island's aesthetic principles, organic and slightly asymmetrical in the way that naturally formed things tend to be, different from the precise geometric trophy of a mainland competition. It was heavy enough that the show depicted Ash adjusting his grip on it, which was a small detail but a real one, the acknowledgement that a physical object has physical properties that a story has to account for rather than simply treating as symbolic. That weight, that realness of the trophy as an object, was part of what made the championship feel genuinely achieved rather than narratively delivered. The journey back to Pallet Town from the Orange Islands was longer than any comparable journey the show had depicted, and the show used the length to do something interesting with the relationship between the achievement and the achiever, showing Ash in the time after the victory rather than cutting directly to arrival. The trophy was real and solid in his hands, and the days of travel back toward Kanto gave him time to sit with what had happened in a way that immediate arrival home would not have permitted. He did not arrive triumphant and ready for the next thing. He arrived thoughtful, still processing. The victory settled into something quieter than triumph and more lasting. The season's understanding of its own place in the larger Pokemon story was visible in the way it handled the transitions at both ends. The departure from Pallet Town at the beginning was connected to events from the first season in ways that honored the continuity without requiring the audience to have perfect recall of every detail. The arrival back in Pallet Town at the end was connected to the beginning of the Johto journey in ways that acknowledged what was coming without undermining the completeness of what had just concluded. The Orange Islands were bounded at both ends by care, by the particular attention of a production that understood it was making a chapter rather than a standalone and honored both the chapter's independence and its place in the larger sequence. What the Orange Islands season ultimately demonstrated was that a story does not have to be the most dramatic or the most consequential version of itself to be worth telling with full attention and care. The season was not Kanto, with its foundational status and its introduction of everything that came to define the series. It was not Johto, with its expanded world and its more ambitious structures. It was the warm thing between those two larger things, the story that allowed the characters to be themselves in a different environment and to discover through that displacement what was essential in them as opposed to what was contingent on circumstances. What was essential in Ash was his attentiveness and his refusal to leave. What was essential in Misty was her practical care and her genuine expertise. What was essential in Tracy was his patient and thorough way of seeing. The Orange Islands gave each of them the conditions to make that essence visible, and then it let them carry it forward into whatever came next. The islands themselves remained, as all places remain after the story that visited them has moved on. The coral grew. The Lapras schools moved through the warm currents. The gym leaders waited for the next challenger to arrive by boat, or Lapras, carrying their earnest ambition and their incomplete preparation and their willingness to be tested. The GS Ball's mystery persisted somewhere in Professor Oak's laboratory, patient as a question that knows the right answer will eventually find it. The sketchbooks, filled with the Orange Island's particular light and its particular creatures, sat in the laboratory alongside it, the record of a careful person's passage through a place that had rewarded careful attention. That is the Orange Islands in its completeness, not a dramatic chapter, not a chapter that changed everything. A warm and open and unhurried story that moved through its islands at the pace of genuine experience rather than at the pace of narrative urgency, and that left its travelers slightly different from how it found them, in the quiet and specific ways that genuine experience changes people without announcing that it has done so. Another quiet detail appears when we consider how the Orange Island season handled the concept of expertise and what it means to possess knowledge that other people in the same situation do not have. The archipelago was full of this kind of specialized knowledge, information specific to particular islands, or particular water conditions, or particular Pokémon behaviors that only made sense in context and could not be meaningfully transferred without the context. The island residents who held this knowledge wore it lightly, the way that people always wear knowledge that is simply the ordinary furniture of their daily lives, not something remarkable but something they have always had, and therefore cannot see the absence of. Ash arrived without it and accumulated it piece by piece through the encounters the season provided, and each piece of local knowledge he gained changed slightly how he navigated the next situation. The exchange of knowledge was one of the season's most consistent, informal structures, present in almost every island encounter, even when the episode's explicit subject was something else entirely. Ash gave the island residents something in return for what they gave him, usually not information, but capability. The ability to address a situation that had been beyond them, and that his particular combination of training and Pokemon made possible. Those exchanges were not transactional in the calculating sense, but in the organic sense, the natural reciprocity of people who have found each other genuinely useful. The Orange Islands worked as a community precisely because that reciprocity flowed freely in multiple directions without needing to be formally negotiated or tracked. The episodic nature of the Orange Island season, the way each island tended to generate its own self-contained story alongside the overarching badge-collecting narrative, was a structural feature that allowed the show to explore a wider range of situations and character types than a more tightly plotted arc would have permitted. A single Kanto town was usually a gym, and the situation around it, with limited time for the community to develop texture. An orange island was visited for long enough that the texture had time to accumulate, the relationships between different residents and different Pokemon becoming visible across the duration of the stay, the particular character of the place establishing itself through accumulated detail rather than establishing shot. The Pokemon contests that appeared in a few Orange Islands episodes, informal competitions of a different kind from the gym challenges, gave the season an opportunity to depict training achievements that were not battle related without framing them as less significant than battle achievement. A Pokemon that moved beautifully, that performed a sequence of actions with grace and timing and evident enjoyment, was doing something real, even if it was not defeating another Pokemon in direct combat. The show handled these moments with the care of something that understood its own implicit hierarchy of values and was occasionally willing to question it, to suggest that the hierarchy was not universal even within its own world, that different communities valued different kinds of excellence, and all of them might be right. Tracy's appreciation for Pokemon that performed rather than battled was consistent with his larger aesthetic philosophy, the sense that what a Pokemon does when it is simply being itself, rather than when it is directed toward a competitive goal, is equally worthy of attention. He sketched the performing Pokemon with the same patient care he brought to the wild ones encountered in their habitats, which was itself an argument, made through practice rather than through statement, that performance and habitat behavior were both forms of the same natural expressiveness, the creature doing what it does because that is what it does. The relationship between observation and intervention was one the season explored with unusual nuance in the episodes involving wild Pokemon populations that were under some kind of stress. There were moments when Ash's impulse was to intervene, to use his Pokemon to address the situation directly, and moments when Tracy's observation first instinct was the more appropriate response, because intervening without understanding would have made things worse rather than better. Those episodes built a kind of implicit argument for patience, for the willingness to watch long enough to understand before acting, and Ash's gradual integration of that patience into his own practice was one of the season's quietest character development arcs, visible only to someone paying attention to the small choices he made over many episodes. The natural catastrophes that affected the Orange Islands during the season, the storms and the tidal events and the geological activity of volcanic islands, were depicted with the honest complexity of things that cannot be defeated or redirected through training, only responded to with whatever resources and capabilities were available. Those episodes required Ash to be useful in ways that had nothing to do with competitive excellence, to be resourceful and quick and willing to collaborate with strangers who were doing their best with limited information and limited time. His performance in those situations was one of the measures the season applied to him that had no badge at the end of it, and his consistent willingness to engage with full effort, regardless of whether there was a formal reward, made a quiet argument about character. The other trainers Ash encountered in the Orange Islands, those who were also working toward the championship through the badge circuit, were depicted with more variety of approach and philosophy than the trainers he had competed against in Kanto. Some were purely competitive, focused entirely on battle performance, and indifferent to everything the archipelago offered beyond its gym challenges. Some were deeply interested in the islands as an environment, and were there as much for the experience as for the competition. Some were local trainers who had grown up in the archipelago and whose relationship with its Pokemon ecology was intimate and long established in ways that arriving trainers could not easily replicate. That variety of approach made the Orange League feel like a real competitive community, rather than a backdrop for Ash's specific journey. The training philosophy that Drake embodied was not something the show made explicit, but something it demonstrated through how he handled the championship battle, the patience with which he paced his team's engagement, the particular quality of calm that characterized his decision-making, even when the battle was going unexpectedly. He was not a trainer who reacted to situations, but one who had seen enough situations that very few of them were truly unexpected anymore, and that depth of experience expressed itself as a kind of settled authority that was different from Sissy's more active expertise or Danny's physical confidence. Drake was what the Orange Islands produced at the end of a long training life, and the championship was not a competition he won so much as an office he maintained, the position of someone who had simply become the best expression of what the Orange League valued. Ash's victory over Drake was therefore not just a competitive achievement, but a kind of passing of a torch, the recognition by the system itself that this particular challenger had reached the level where the championship legitimately belonged to them. Drake did not seem diminished by the loss, and in this was an important detail. He had been defeated by someone who had genuinely earned the victory, and his composure in defeat was itself a model of what the championship was supposed to represent: the ability to compete at the highest level with full commitment and to accept the outcome of genuine competition without requiring it to be something other than it was. The Orange League trophy ceremony was brief enough that the brevity was itself significant, a recognition that the achievement needed no elaboration. The season had spent 30-some episodes building toward this moment, and the moment arrived and passed without being inflated into something it was not, which was the right choice. Real achievements do not require ceremony to be real. They are simply real, present in the record and in the person who accomplished them, and the Orange Island season trusted that its audience understood this without needing to be told. The days after the Drake battle and before the return to Pallet Town were among the season's most quietly interesting, unstructured time in the aftermath of the achievement, time that had no particular purpose, and that the show used to let its characters simply exist in the space of what had just happened. Ash sat with the trophy and looked at the ocean. Tracy filled the last pages of a sketchbook and began a new one. Misty thought about what came next, in ways the show implied but did not make explicit. Those days were the Orange Islands saying goodbye to its travelers before they began the journey home, offering a final stretch of the particular warmth that the season had been made of. The return voyage was longer in narrative time than the journey out had been, weighted with the completeness of the season behind it. Lapra carried them back toward the mainland, through water that was still warm, but somehow felt different, the particular quality of water that one travels through with a destination behind rather than ahead. The horizon that had always represented possibility during the season's outward journey represented arrival on the way back, the approach of home rather than the promise of something new, and that shift in what the horizon meant changed how the water and the light and the distance felt to be inside. Ash's silence, stirring parts of the return voyage, was handled with the care that the show brought to its character's inner life when it chose to depict it, not with internal monologue or external statement, but with the quality of his attention, where it rested and for how long. He looked back in the direction the Orange Islands had been more than once, and this small backward-looking gesture was the show's most direct acknowledgement that he understood the season as something that was now complete, not still happening but past, present only in what it had left in him. Misty's forward attention during the same voyage was an equally character-specific response, her natural orientation toward the next thing rather than the last one, the practical sensibility that found more use in readying herself for what was coming than in dwelling on what had been. She was not indifferent to what the Orange Islands had been. She simply processed experience differently, storing it efficiently and moving forward rather than carrying it at the surface and looking at it. That processing style was part of what made her a useful traveling companion, the ability to be fully present in each successive situation without the weight of accumulated sentiment slowing the forward movement. The homecoming unfolded in stages, each one adding a layer to the return. The first sight of the mainland coastline carried a particular quality of recognition, the shapes of the land against the sky, familiar in a way that the Orange Islands had never been, home in the specific visual sense, rather than merely the nominal one. The harbor at the mainland entry point had the character of a place that connected the island world to the continental one, a transitional space where the two aesthetics met and mingled, the salt and openness of the ocean mixed with the more enclosed and purposeful quality of land based infrastructure. The road from the harbor back toward Pallet Town was one of the most familiar road types in the show, the kind that had appeared in Kanto throughout the first season. The road with its grass verges and its trees and its occasional small buildings set back from the edge. Walking it after the Orange Islands gave it a quality it had not had before, the quality of something seen fresh rather than taken for granted, the particular appreciation that comes from having been somewhere different and then returning. The trees were familiar. The road surface was familiar. The quality of light, slightly cooler than the Orange Island's warmth, was familiar. All of these familiarities accumulated into something that felt like homecoming in a way that could only be produced by genuine absence. Pallet Town itself received Ash with the particular quality of small places that know their own character and are secure in it. It was not impressive by any objective standard. It was a small town at the edge of a region, home to a famous researcher and not much else of external significance. But it was also the place that Ash Ketchum had left with a single Pokeball and a borrowed Pikachu and the enormous unfocused ambition of 10 years old, and returning to it with a championship trophy and a changed relationship with the world was its own kind of argument about what a place can mean to someone who grew up in it and left it and came back to it carrying what the leaving had made possible. Delia's reception of her son was the season's final human warmth, the particular quality of maternal attention that notices things others miss, that reads the subtle indicators of how someone has changed through the accumulated evidence of small details. She saw something different in Ash that he could not quite have articulated, something that had settled in him during the Orange Islands journey, and she received that change with the particular pride of someone who had expected it to happen and was glad to see it confirmed. Her response to the trophy was comic, yes, but the comedy was the form her genuine appreciation took, the particular language of a parent who expresses pride through deflection because direct expression would be too large to contain in ordinary conversation. Professor Oak's reception of the GS ball at the season's end circled back to the season's beginning with the satisfying quality of a frame closing cleanly. He had sent the object out into the archipelago at the start and received it back at the end, and between those two events, the entire Orange Islands journey had happened, all of it held within the frame of that small, mysterious object, traveling from one researcher's hands to another's. The GS ball had not been opened. It had not explained itself. It simply returned unchanged and unchanged for, carrying its mystery intact through everything that had surrounded it. Professor Oak received it with the same patient curiosity he had sent it with, which was itself a kind of answer to the question it posed, the suggestion that some mysteries are worth maintaining precisely because the quality of attention they generate is more valuable than the closure their resolution would provide. The laboratory that received the travelers at the season's end was the laboratory that had been there all along, unchanged by their absence, in the way that stable things remain unchanged while the people who belong to them are off becoming slightly different versions of themselves. The Pokémon in the paddock greeted Ash with the enthusiasm of creatures for whom his return was simply the most recent in a long series of returns, each one expected and each one welcome. Tracy's first sight of the laboratory that would become his permanent home was depicted with the quiet excitement of someone who recognizes a right place when they encounter it, the particular quality of arrival that feels like finding rather than reaching. What the Orange Islands gave to each of its travelers was exactly what each of them needed, which is the quality that genuinely good journeys tend to have. Ash needed tests that went beyond the predictable and training that required adaptability. He received them. Misty needed the opportunity to be genuinely useful in ways that went beyond her role as Ash's companion and Togepi's guardian. The coastal and maritime setting of the Orange Islands provided that opportunity repeatedly. Tracy needed the experience of seeing the kind of thing he had been training himself to see, Pokemon, in genuinely varied and ecologically rich environments that rewarded patient observation. The archipelago was full of exactly that experience, and Brock needed apparently to stay for a while with Professor Ivy on Valencia Island, which is a need the show honored without explanation and without apology. The Orange Islands understood its travelers and gave them what they needed in the form that the place itself could offer. That is what the best journeys do, not what you plan for them to do, but what they discover you needed and provide without asking whether you had planned for it. The archipelago did not know what Ash needed, but it had the particular quality of a place that is fully itself, that has not been arranged for visitors' convenience, but simply exists in its own character and abundance, and places that are fully themselves tend to have what travelers need precisely because they are not trying to be anything other than what they are. That is the final gift of the Orange Islands, the lesson underneath all the other lessons, visible only in retrospect. The place did not try to be instructive. It simply was what it was, warm and open and specific and full of its own logic, and being in it taught things that no deliberate curriculum could have taught, because the teaching was not the point. The point was the place, and the teaching happened in the background of the experience, the way all genuine learning happens, not when you are trying to learn, but when you are simply paying attention to something real. The water was warm and the sky was wide, and the company was good, and the Lapras knew the way home. Those are the Orange Islands. That is what they were. That is what they remain in the memory of everyone who traveled through them, in the particular quality of warmth that does not fade even when the details begin to soften at the edges. The coral badges, the crystal cave. The Charizard kept warm through the cold hours before dawn. The GS ball smooth and gold and closed. Tracy's pencil moving across paper. Lapras swimming into the school of its family, and the water closing behind it. The trophy heavy in young hands, carrying the particular weight of something genuinely earned. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.